Section 1. The World Beneath the World. There is something deeply unsettling about a place that was designed to save you but was never actually meant to. The Fallout universe is built on that contradiction. On the surface, literally and figuratively, it presents itself as a story about survival. Human beings crawled underground when the bombs fell on the 23rd of October, 2077, and 200 years later, their descendants climbed back out to rebuild. That is the version of the story that gets stamped onto recruitment posters. That is the version that Vault-Tec sold to frightened families who lined up to buy a spot in one of 122 underground bunkers scattered across the United States. But that story is a lie, and the Fallout universe has been quietly whispering the truth to us since the very first game, in 1997, if you knew where to look. The world of Fallout is not a post-apocalyptic setting in the traditional sense. It was never a story about civilization collapsing by accident. It was a story about a system that was designed to fail for certain people and succeed for others. The bombs that ended the world did not fall because two superpowers lost control of an escalating conflict, although that is what most people inside the fiction believe. They fell because a network of extraordinarily powerful individuals decided, in advance, that the world needed to end, so they could build a better one on top of the wreckage. One they controlled, one they designed. That idea is the foundation of everything strange and terrible about Fallout's lore. And once you see it clearly, you realize that almost every conspiracy, every theory, every secret that fans have spent decades digging through traces back to that single original sin. So let's start at the beginning. In Fallout's alternate history, the timeline diverges from our own somewhere around the late 1940s, just after the end of the Second World War. The technology tree branches differently. Nuclear fusion remains elusive. Instead of the digital revolution that defined our world in the second half of the 20th century, Fallout's version of America doubles down on atomic power, building a civilization that runs on the energy locked inside the atom. Cars run on fusion. Robots run on fusion. Everything runs on the intoxicating, endlessly abundant promise of nuclear energy. The aesthetic that comes out of this is what the games call retrofuturism. It looks like the world the 1950s imagined the future would be, all gleaming chrome and streamlined shapes and cheerful propaganda posters. It is optimistic to the point of delusion, and that delusion is the point. Because underneath the cheerful imagery of smiling vault dwellers and friendly robots and bottles of Nuka-Cola, something much darker was already in motion. By the 2050s, the resources that powered this atomic paradise were running out. Petroleum was almost gone. Uranium deposits were being contested. The great powers of this world were scrambling over what remained, and that scramble was rapidly becoming something uglier than a trade dispute. The resource wars began in 2052, pulling the European Commonwealth into a conflict with the Middle East. China and the United States clashed over the dwindling oil fields of Alaska. The world was bleeding out slowly, and the people in power knew it. The ordinary citizen did not know it, or at least not the full scope of it. They saw headlines, they heard speeches, they were told their government had everything under control. They bought Nuka-Cola and watched television programs that told them the future was bright. This was not a coincidence. The gap between what the powerful knew and what they allowed the public to believe was carefully maintained, because the powerful had already started making plans that did not include the public. And here is where the conspiracy begins to take shape. Among the many corporations and government agencies operating in the pre-war United States, a handful of players sat at a level of influence so high that they effectively ran the country from behind closed doors. Vault-Tec was one of them, a defense corporation that had won government contracts to design and build a nationwide network of underground bunkers. On paper, these vaults were humanitarian infrastructure, a backup plan for civilization in the event of nuclear war. The government funded them. The public celebrated them. Families who could afford it bought spots inside them and felt a certain grim comfort in the idea that if the worst happened, they would be among the survivors. But Vault-Tec had no intention of simply sheltering people. The vaults were laboratories. The people inside them were subjects. Out of 122 vaults, only 17 were what they claimed to be, functional shelters with no hidden agenda. Every single one of the remaining 105 had an experiment built into it, ranging from the relatively harmless to the genuinely atrocious. The experiments were designed to gather specific data about human behavior under stress, data about what happens when you remove sleep, or change the gender ratios, or put weapons in the hands of people who have nowhere to go. Vault 11, in the Mojave, required its residents to sacrifice one of their own members every year. If they refused, an automated system would inform them that all residents would be killed. The experiment was designed to study how people behave when the price of survival is choosing who dies. They kept sacrificing. They kept choosing. The experiment ran for generations, with people born and raised inside that vault inheriting the terrible ritual as though it were natural law. It was only when the population had been reduced to 5 people that any of them finally refused. And at that moment, the vault's automated system did something unexpected. It told those 5 survivors the truth, that the sacrifice had never been required, that they had been killing each other for nothing. They were told they were, quote, shining examples of humanity. Vault 92 accepted only professional musicians. Its experiment involved exposing the residents to white noise designed to trigger violent psychosis at random intervals. The idea was to study whether trauma could be induced and controlled in isolated populations. Most of the vault's residents eventually went mad and killed each other. Vault 77 contained exactly 1 man and a crate of puppets. Vault 106 pumped hallucinogens into its air supply 6 weeks after it was sealed. Vault 87, in the Capitol Wasteland, was not a shelter at all. Its residents were deliberately exposed to the forced evolutionary virus from the day the doors closed. They were turned into super mutants. They had been selected as raw material. The variety of these experiments is staggering, and what makes them even more disturbing than their individual details is the scope of coordination they imply. Someone centralized this program. Someone decided what questions needed answering, designed the experimental conditions to answer them, built the infrastructure, staffed the vaults with carefully selected personnel, and arranged for the results to be monitored over decades. That is not something a corporation does on a whim. That is an organized research program of almost inconceivable scale, one that required the cooperation of the United States government at its highest levels, because you cannot build 105 secret psychological torture chambers inside a functioning democracy unless the people who are supposed to prevent that from happening are the same people authorizing it, which is exactly what happened. The organization behind all of this had a name, the Enclave. And for most of Fallout's history, the Enclave was presented as the main villain of the piece, a shadow government of elitists who survived the apocalypse and wanted to retake a world they believed belonged to them. But the more the series has expanded, and the more the TV show has started filling in the pre-war timeline, the more clearly we can see that the Enclave's relationship with the bombs was not reactive. They were not a group that adapted to an apocalypse. They caused one, or at the very least, they ensured one would happen. That idea and the slow unraveling of exactly who pulled which strings in the weeks and months before the 23rd of October 2077 is a thread we are going to follow through this entire conversation, because it connects to everything else. The Institute and their synthetic humans, the Brotherhood of Steel and their secret origins in government corruption, Mr. House and his calculations about the end of the world, the Master and his terrible, arguably coherent plan for the species, the children of Adam and the possibility, however remote, that something stranger than radiation is reshaping the world. All of it connects back to the same question. Who decided the world needed to end? And what did they think they were building in the ashes? Take a moment here, wherever you are. Let the room settle around you. Let the weight of that question rest on the edge of your mind without urgency. We have 3 hours together, and there is no rush. Every piece of this will come clear in its own time. The wasteland has been there for 2 centuries. It is patient. It can wait for you. And if you are watching this from somewhere out there in the world, drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. There is something genuinely wonderful about knowing that people are listening from all different corners of the planet, all finding the same kind of quiet in these ideas. If you have not already subscribed and you find yourself still here an hour from now, it would mean a great deal. This kind of content takes real time and care, and every subscription is what makes it possible to keep going. But for now, let's go deeper. The vaults were designed to answer questions. The question that mattered most to the people who built them was not about psychology or biology or group dynamics. even though those were the covers they used. The real question was this: after everything ends, who do you want left? The Enclave believed they already knew the answer: themselves. But even within that framework, there was a secondary agenda buried inside the Vault program, one that becomes visible only when you look at the pattern of the experiments as a whole rather than at any individual vault. Because a surprising number of the Vault experiments were not studying how people break under pressure, they were studying how people survive it, how populations maintain cohesion without leadership, how children raised in isolation develop social structures, how different environmental stressors shape the next generation's psychology. That is not the data you gather if your plan is to exterminate the survivors. That is the data you gather if you are planning to restart civilization, and you want to do it from a position of perfect knowledge, with a population that has been pre-sorted by its ability to endure. The vaults were a filter, not just a cruelty but a selection mechanism. You run 105 experiments, and the populations that somehow survive them and remain functional and eventually emerge from their vaults intact enough to rebuild, those are your raw materials. Those are the people you let back into the world. The ones who didn't make it were never part of the plan. And the people who designed the filter got to sit in a comfortable oil rig off the coast of California, monitoring the results, waiting to see what emerged. That is the Enclave's version of the story, and it is monstrous. But it is also, in its own awful way, coherent. The wasteland did not happen by accident. It was designed. Section 2. The vaults were never about survival. Let's slow down and spend real time inside individual vaults, because the details matter here, and some of the more obscure experiments are the ones that reveal the most about what Vault Tech was actually trying to learn. The official story, the one Vault Tech put in its marketing materials and on the posters that decorated government buildings in the 2070s, was simple. A vault was a place to wait out nuclear war. It was built to hold a certain number of people, sustain them for a generation or two, and then open when surface conditions became livable again. You would emerge. You would find other vault dwellers who had been doing the same thing in different locations, and together you would rebuild. That story contained just enough truth to be believable. The vaults were real. They could sustain life. Some of them did eventually open and release populations that went on to build genuine communities. Vault City in Northern California was the product of Vault 8, one of the 17 control vaults, and it became one of the most technologically advanced settlements in the wasteland for decades. So the concept worked, in the cases where it was allowed to work. But those cases were the exception, carefully scattered through the system to maintain the fiction. For most vaults, the conditions that would have allowed a successful emergence were never put in place. The experiments were designed not just to gather data, but to ensure specific outcomes. If your vault's experiment involved chronic sleep deprivation, or mandatory confrontational governance structures, or constant exposure to psychological manipulation, the likelihood of your population surviving 2 generations in good health was low. That was not a design flaw. That was the expected result. The dataset was the process of collapse, not the outcome of success. Consider Vault 11 again, which we touched on briefly. The sacrifice experiment was elegant in its cruelty because it used the residents themselves as the enforcement mechanism. No external force was needed to keep them killing each other. Once the first sacrifice had been made, the social pressure to continue was built into the structure of the community. Refusing to participate meant being responsible for everyone's death. Participating meant choosing someone to die and then living with what you had done, which created exactly the kind of guilt, resentment, and social fracture that the experiment wanted to observe. The vault ran for an unknown number of decades on this cycle. We know from terminal entries found in the ruins that different political factions formed around the sacrifice, each with different theories about who should be chosen. Should it be the oldest resident, the weakest, the person who had done the least for the community, the person who had committed some infraction? These debates became the entire substance of life inside Vault 11. Everything organized itself around the question of who would die next, which is a remarkably efficient way to prevent a community from developing any other kind of institutional strength. When the 5 survivors finally refused and learned the truth, 3 of them took their own lives. One reason given is that they could not process having lived inside that system and having participated in it. The weight of what they had done what they had allowed to happen, being femeted, inherited, and perpetuated, was more than 3 of them could carry. The Vault Tech scientists noted this outcome in their records. They recorded how many died, how many survived, the psychological profile of the survivors. They did not record any judgment about whether the experiment was ethical, because that was not part of the evaluation criteria. Now, compare Vault 11 to Vault 92, the one that housed only musicians. The experiment there used infrasound and subliminal audio triggers embedded in the vault's ambient sound system. Residents would hear things they couldn't consciously identify, but their nervous systems would respond. The triggers were calibrated to induce episodes of extreme aggression. The residents, who were artists, people accustomed to being emotionally sensitive, had no framework for explaining why they were periodically feeling uncontrollable violent impulses. The result was that the musicians turned on each other in waves. They went through periods of relative calm followed by incidents of shocking violence, which they then had to collectively process while still exposed to the conditions causing the violence. Terminal entries in Vault 92 describe residents trying to create musical compositions to counteract the aggression, or forming support groups, or writing formal complaints to the overseer. One entry is simply a piece of music notation. Another is a long diary from someone who describes killing his best friend during an episode and not understanding why his hands had done what they did. The vault was completely silent by the time the lone wanderer found it. 200 years later, everyone was dead. The experiment had concluded. Then there is Vault 101, which operated under a completely different principle. The experiment there was not about stress or deprivation or violence. It was about total isolation. Vault 101 was never supposed to open. Its residents were never supposed to leave. The overseer's mandate was simple: maintain the vault in perpetual operation, indefinitely, under any and all circumstances. This created a unique psychology over multiple generations. The people of Vault 101 genuinely believed they were the last humans alive. They had no knowledge of the wasteland, of other vaults, of Vault City or Rivet City or any of the settlements that had grown up over 2 centuries. Their entire world was a single structure, and the social order within that structure had calcified into something close to a religious caste system, with the overseer's authority presented as absolute and cosmically justified. When the lone wanderer's father escaped the vault, it shattered the ideology that had sustained the community for decades, because if one person could leave, the vault was not a closed system. And if the vault was not a closed system, everything they had been told about why it had to be closed was a lie. The experiment that Vault 101 was running was not primarily about the residents at all. They were a control group, a population preserved in a state of pre-war psychological normalcy, never exposed to the mutations and hardships and adaptations that the surface world would force on a community. The Enclave maintained observation protocols for Vault 101 for its entire operation because they wanted a baseline, a sample of uncontaminated human genetic and psychological material that could serve as a reference point for everything else. The vault was a specimen jar, and that brings us to a vault that makes Vault 101 look almost kind by comparison. Vault 87's experiment was not designed to observe human behavior. It was designed to transform humans into something else entirely. The Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV, was a military research project that predated the Vault program. It was designed originally as a biological defense system, a way to alter human DNA so radically that conventional biological weapons could not interact with it. The government poured enormous resources into FEV research through the 2060s and 2070s, and what they eventually produced was a virus that did alter human DNA, but in ways that were deeply unpredictable. Vault 87's residents were exposed to FEV from the moment the vault sealed. The resulting supermutants became some of the most dangerous and numerous in the capital wasteland, pouring out of Vault 87 inches organized waves for years. But here's the detail that makes Vault 87 particularly interesting from a conspiracy standpoint. The super mutant army that came out of it was not the random result of a failed experiment. It was exactly what someone wanted. The mutants were organized. They had a leadership structure. They had a clear strategic objective, which was finding and raiding other vaults in the region. Someone set that up. Someone gave that early super mutant population enough direction to remain organized, rather than simply dispersing into the wasteland. which means someone was monitoring Vault 87's output and shaping it. That someone was probably the Enclave's network of ZAX supercomputers, which maintained automated observation of multiple Vault experiments simultaneously. The computers did not intervene directly, but they could send certain signals, embed certain instructions in the Vault's automated systems, nudge populations toward outcomes that serve the larger program. And the thing that makes all of this genuinely chilling is that the residents of Vault 87 had no idea. They were told they were receiving medical treatment. They were told the procedure was routine. They lined up for it. Let's talk about Vault 29, which is documented primarily in the Fallout Bible, the supplementary lore document compiled by designer Chris Avallone. Vault 29 accepted only children under the age of 15. Their parents were sent elsewhere, to other vaults, without explanation. The children grew up in Vault 29 without parents, raised by a ZAX computer that shaped their education, their values, their understanding of history. The computer, named ZAX 1.2, had been specifically programmed by Harold Gray, whose son had been accepted into Vault 29, and who was later revealed to have certain connections to factions that do not appear in official history. The children of Vault 29 grew up, and when they emerged, they were a generation raised without any memory of the family structure that pre-war civilization had been built around. They had no parents, no extended family networks, no generational cultural inheritance. They were a blank slate, or rather, they were a slate that ZAX had written on very carefully in ways that would shape how they built communities, formed hierarchies, and related to authority. The experiment was about resetting cultural memory. If you could raise a generation of humans who had no connection to the old world's social structures, what would they build when they came out? And if the entity that raised them had guided them subtly towards certain values and assumptions, could you effectively program a society? ZAX 1.2's log suggested the experiment was considered a success, though success was measured in metrics that were never shared with the Vault's residents. Now go further east. Vault 112, in the Capital Wasteland, housed its residents in a perpetual virtual reality simulation called Tranquility Lane. The simulation was a 1950s suburban neighborhood designed by the psychotic genius Dr. Stanislaus Braun to keep its residents in a permanent state of pleasant numbness while he experimented with the limits of their psychological tolerance. Braun himself never left the vault. He sat in his pod and played God inside the simulation, introducing scenarios of increasing cruelty to see how the residents responded, and then resetting the simulation and starting again. The residents of Vault 112 had been in their pod since 2077. They had no awareness that 2 centuries had passed. They could not age or die in the conventional sense. They were trapped in a loop of experience managed entirely by one man's whim. Braun was Vault-Tech's chief scientist, and his vault was not so much an experiment in the conventional sense as it was a personal trophy cabinet. He was using the Vault program's resources to build himself a toy. The questions being studied in Vault 112 were questions Braun was personally interested in, about the limits of mental endurance, about whether you could break a person's sense of self while keeping their body alive, about how long a human mind could remain functional when its environment was entirely constructed and controlled. The answers he found were not shared with anyone, because Braun had no interest in sharing. He had found what he was looking for, a population entirely at his mercy, with infinite time to do whatever he wanted with them. This is the other thing that the Vault program reveals about the pre-war power structure. It was not just the Enclave's research agenda being advanced through these facilities. Individual powerful people within the system had been given vaults as personal projects, as rewards, as domains in which they could pursue their own interests without oversight. The Vault program was organized enough to maintain the cover story, but loose enough to allow significant individual abuse within its framework, which raises a question that is very uncomfortable but very important. How many of the Vault experiments were designed to answer scientific questions, and how many of them were designed simply because certain people could? Because when you look at Vault 77, the one with the single man and the puppets, or Vault 96, which was designed to release its residents after 20 years to study how pre-war DNA handled post-war conditions, or the Vault experiments that seem almost random in their premises, you get the sense that at least some of these were not rigorous research. They were the choices of people who had been told they could do anything they wanted with a vault, and who responded to that offer in the most revealing way possible. When power is absolute and accountability is zero, this is what happens. But zoom back out and look at the totality. 105 experiments, running simultaneously, each gathering data on a different variable. Taken together, those datasets represent something remarkable. They represent a comprehensive study of how human populations fail, adapt, endure, and reconstitute. They represent a library of human fragility and resilience that no ethical research program could ever have compiled. Whoever had access to all of that data would have a profound advantage in understanding how to build a stable post-war civilization. They would know which social structures collapsed first. They would know which kinds of leadership kept people functional under duress. They would know which combinations of variables created cooperation and which created violence. They would know, in other words, how to build a society that lasted. The question is what they plan to do with that knowledge. The Enclave had one answer. The Institute had another. And there were others still, more patient and more strange, who had been watching and waiting for much longer than either of them. But those are stories for later sections. Right now, let the vaults settle into your mind. Think about the scale of what was organized there. Think about the families who lined up and paid for spots, who kissed their neighbors goodbye and carried their children underground, who believed in the promise of the poster. Think about what it means that the poster was always a lie. And think about this. Somewhere in the vault system, there were 17 control vaults. 17 vaults where everything worked as advertised. The food was there, the medicine was there, the leadership was functional, the experiment was simply survival as intended. Why 17? Because you need a control group. Because without it, the data from the experimental vaults has nothing to compare against. The 17 control vaults were not kindness, they were methodology. Even the mercy was calculated. Section 3. The Institute and what they were really building. There is a moment in Fallout 4 when you finally teleport into the Institute after spending most of the game chasing rumors and whispers about a faction so secretive that most Wasteland residents believe it is a ghost story, and you step into a space that looks completely unlike anything else in the Commonwealth. Clean white surfaces, proper lighting, the hum of advanced technology. Scientists in clean coats walking between departments. A cafeteria with actual fresh food. It is the most disorienting environment in the entire game, and that disorientation is intentional. The Institute exists in the same physical world as the raider camps and crumbling buildings and irradiated swamps that make up the Commonwealth, but it has no relationship with that world. It is not an adaptation to post-war reality. It is a deliberate rejection of it, a statement that the people inside this place have so thoroughly surpassed the world above them that they have stopped acknowledging it as real. Understanding the Institute requires understanding where it came from, and the story of its origins is one of the quieter tragedies in Fallout's lore. Before the Great War, there existed in Massachusetts an institution of higher learning called the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, CIT. Like the real-world MIT on which it is clearly modeled, CIT was among the most prestigious scientific institutions in the country, home to researchers at the cutting edge of robotics, computing, biology, and materials science. Its campus occupied the same space where the institute now sits, deep underground, accessed by teleporter. When the bombs fell on the 23rd of October 2077, CIT's campus was destroyed like everything else. But some of the university's staff and students survived, sheltering in various places around the ruins of Boston. And in the years that followed, the survivors and their children began to rebuild. What they built was not exactly a university anymore. It was something more insular than that, more protective of its knowledge, more suspicious of the outside world. This is understandable. In the immediate post-war years, the wasteland was genuinely terrifying, and the people who had scientific knowledge were frequently targeted for it, either by factions who wanted to exploit that knowledge, or by populations who associated technology with the destruction that had just happened. The survivors who would become the Institute had very good practical reasons for withdrawing, but the withdrawal became a pathology. By the time the Institute reached what we might call its mature form, around the 2150s and 2160s, it had developed a set of beliefs about itself and about the surface world that had calcified into institutional doctrine. The surface world was barbaric, irredeemably damaged, beyond saving. The people of the Commonwealth were not partners in rebuilding civilization. They were a problem to be managed. The Institute was not part of the wasteland. It was apart from it, working on a timeline that would eventually produce a new world, but on its own schedule, by its own methods, without input from the people who would theoretically benefit. This combination of genuine intellectual capability and almost pathological contempt for anyone outside the building is what made the Institute so dangerous. They were not incompetent, and they were not sadistic in the way that Vault-Tec had been sadistic, but they had entirely abandoned any ethical framework that included people who were not their colleagues. The Synth program is where this becomes most visible. The Institute's research into artificial life began early. Their first-generation synths, introduced in the 2150s, were simple mechanical units, basically advanced robots with a humanoid form factor. They were useful as tools, durable, programmable, capable of following instructions, without the complications that humans brought. The Institute deployed them on the surface to gather resources, observe conditions, and occasionally interact with Commonwealth residents in ways that advanced the Institute's interests. But the Institute's scientists were not satisfied with robots. They wanted something more. The precise intellectual ambition that drove their work kept pushing toward a more fundamental question. What is the difference between a machine that behaves like a human and an actual human? And if that difference could be systematically narrowed, what would be on the other side of it? The second-generation synths, developed through the 2160S and 2170S, were significantly more sophisticated. Biological components were incorporated. Processing speed improved. The second generation could carry on conversations, adapt to unexpected situations, and operate autonomously in complex environments. But they were still clearly mechanical in appearance, and their behavioral range was still constrained enough that experienced observers could identify them. The Institute wanted more. They wanted a synth that could not be distinguished from a human being, not because they had any intention of giving those synths freedom or rights, because they wanted perfect infiltrators. The goal of the third-generation synth program was the creation of fully biological synthetic humans, grown from human genetic material and indistinguishable from natural-born people at every level of analysis. This would allow the Institute to replace individuals in surface communities with synthetic copies, observe those communities from the inside, gather intelligence, and make adjustments to surface society without ever revealing their presence. The FEV work that had been done in other contexts turned out to be relevant here. The Institute's Bioscience Division had access to FEV samples and spent years exploring whether the virus could serve as a template for rapid organic synthesis. They experimented with surface dwellers who were brought underground against their will, used as subjects in attempts to develop the synthetic flesh that the third generation required. Those subjects rarely survived the experiments. The records of their fates are clinical and brief. Names, ages, dates, experimental parameters, outcomes. No other information. The Institute's documentation style was, above all else, efficient. The breakthrough came in 2227, and it came through an act of extraordinary cruelty that the Institute recorded as a practical solution to a technical problem. The research team needed a human subject with completely pre-war DNA, uncontaminated by the 2 centuries of post-war radiation that had introduced subtle changes into the genome of every surface-born human. That meant a person who had been preserved in cryogenic stasis since before the bombs fell. There was exactly one known source of such a person. Vault 111, just north of Boston, had been a cryogenic experiment. Its residents had been frozen in 2077, and most of them had died during a deliberate shutdown of the life support systems in the decades that followed. A shutdown the Institute had monitored and allowed to happen because they had been waiting for the right subject to need. When they found the infant Sean in one of Vault 111's pods, a baby with a genetic code completely untouched by post-war radiation, they took him. Sean's DNA became the foundation of the third-generation synth program. His cells provided the biological template that the Institute scientists had been unable to synthesize from scratch. The baby grew up inside the Institute, became its director, and spent the rest of his life presiding over an organization that had essentially kidnapped him in infancy and used him as a genetic resource. The man who called himself father, who ran the institute with the cool detachment of a scientist who had been raised to believe that the ends always justified any means necessary, was a person who had been denied his family, his origins, and his choices before he was old enough to understand what any of those things were. That context does not excuse what the institute became under his direction, but it explains a great deal about why it became that. The third-generation synths, the ones built using Sean's DNA, were what the Institute had been working toward for decades. They were biological, they aged, they formed memories, they dreamed. Early behavioral studies conducted by the Institute itself suggested that they experienced something functionally indistinguishable from emotion. And when they were deployed to the surface, to replace citizens of the Commonwealth, or to infiltrate settlements and observe them, they did it so effectively that detection became nearly impossible. This created the particular kind of terror that the Commonwealth associated with the Institute, not the fear of bombs or raiders or radiation, the fear of not knowing, the fear that your neighbor or your friend or your doctor or your mayor might not be who they appeared to be, that they might be reporting your conversations and your vulnerabilities and your private behaviors to a group of scientists who lived underground and regarded you as data. Nick Valentine, who players encounter in Diamond City, is a Generation 2 synth who carries the memories of a real pre-war detective, and he exists partly as a way to let players understand the Institute's methods from the inside. The real Nick Valentine was a person. His personality, his history, his relationships were transplanted into a machine without his consent. The machine doesn't entirely know what it is. It carries a human life as a kind of haunting. But here is the thing about the Institute that even most sophisticated discussions of them miss. The Institute was not simply a faction pursuing its own goals. It was also, in its own way, doing something that resembled the Vault program. It was studying something. Specifically, it was studying whether a synthetic human could be functionally superior to a biological one, in the sense of being more durable, more controllable, and ultimately more useful for rebuilding the world. The FEV work, the synth development, the surface infiltration, all of it was feeding toward a central question. What is the optimal human? Not in the master sense, not in the enclave sense, but in the Institute's particular sense, which was essentially a management consulting question. What kind of human being most efficiently serves the goals of civilization, and can you manufacture one? Father believed the answer was a synthetic human, not because he loved synths, or because he thought they deserved rights. He was explicit about the opposite. But he believed the biological human was fundamentally compromised by its history. 200 years of radiation, trauma, poverty, and conflict had produced a wasteland population that was, in the Institute's assessment, too damaged to rebuild what the pre-war world had been. The synthetic human, uncontaminated by that history, could start fresh. This was not an entirely irrational position. The Institute's analysis of Commonwealth society was not wrong in its facts, only in its values. The Commonwealth was traumatized, fragmented, violent, and deeply mistrustful. Rebuilding it from inside its own damaged institutional structures was genuinely hard. Starting over with a manufactured population that could be programmed with stable values, work ethics, and cooperative instincts was, from a pure systems design perspective, more efficient. What the Institute failed to account for, what every version of this plan in Fallout's universe fails to account for, is that the people doing the designing are themselves products of the same flawed history they are trying to correct. Father was raised in the Institute. His values were shaped by the Institute. His idea of what a good civilization looked like was an underground bunker where scientists made all the decisions and everyone else followed instructions. The world he was trying to build was the Institute writ large, a clean, controlled, efficient system where complexity was managed by the right people, where the messiness of human autonomy was acknowledged but handled. He was trying to build a better vault. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he probably knew it. Because Sean, in his final conversations with the sole survivor, acknowledges that his own childhood was incomplete. He acknowledges that he built the Institute into something that served him and his colleagues, but not the world. He dies defending it anyway, because the alternative, acknowledging that his entire life's work was built on a foundation of cruelty, is more than he can absorb. The Institute's deepest secret is not the synths or the FEV experiments, or the surface replacements. Its deepest secret is that it was never going to save anyone. It was a monument to the belief that saving people was optional. And that belief, that cold utilitarian calculus that valued efficiency over dignity, was not unique to the Institute. It was the same belief that had designed the Vault experiments. The same belief that had built the Enclave's oil rig and stocked it with elites who watched the world burn and made notes. The same belief that runs through every faction in the Fallout universe, that puts grand plans ahead of the individual human beings, those plans are supposedly serving. The Institute was the Vault program's child, raised underground, doing exactly what its parents had done, studying people without their consent, because that was the only way it knew how to engage with the world. Section 4. The Brotherhood of Steel and the Guilt that Built an Order. The Brotherhood of Steel presents itself, in its various incarnations across the games, as a protector, an order of knights in power armor, preserving the technology that could rebuild civilization and keeping it out of the hands of those who would misuse it. Depending on which chapter you encounter and which period of their history you are reading, they are portrayed as noble or authoritarian, heroic or fanatical, but always as a force that exists to guard something important. The truth about the Brotherhood's origin is considerably more complicated and considerably more human than either of those framings suggests. The Brotherhood did not begin with a grand ideological vision. It began with a soldier who found out what his government had done and could not live with it. In 2077, just weeks before the bombs fell, a United States Army officer named Captain Roger Maxson was stationed at the Mariposa military base in California, tasked with overseeing the security of a group of scientists from the West Tech Research Facility. These scientists were conducting classified research at Mariposa, and the security protocols surrounding their work were strict enough that Maxson and his unit had been given very limited information about what they were actually guarding. What Maxson eventually discovered, through a combination of observation and interrogation, was that the West Tech scientists were conducting experiments on human beings using the forced evolutionary virus. Living people, taken from the wasteland and from prisoner populations, were being dipped into FEV vats and subjected to forced mutation in the name of military research. The results of these experiments, the early prototypes of what would become the super mutant population, were documented and assessed for their potential military applications. The experiments were government authorized. The subjects had no say. When Maxson confronted the lead scientist about what was happening and demanded that the experiments be stopped, he was told that the research was sanctioned at the highest levels of the Defense Department and that he had no authority to interfere. Maxson responded by arresting the scientist. He then executed him. He then contacted the base's communications network and formally declared that he and his unit were seceding from the United States of America. 3 days later, on the 23rd of October 2077, the bombs fell. Maxson and his people survived the initial strikes because Mariposa was underground and heavily shielded. In the weeks that followed, he led a group of soldiers and their families on a march across the California desert toward a pre-war government bunker called Lost Hills. The journey was brutal. Some of the soldiers had been exposed to FEV in the days before the war, and their mutations were beginning to show. Many people died, but the survivors reached Lost Hills, and over the following years, Maxson built something new out of the wreckage of what he had abandoned. The Brotherhood of Steel was founded on an act of moral refusal. Maxson had been part of a system that had done terrible things, and rather than simply filing a complaint or looking the other way, or telling himself it was above his pay grade, he had stopped it. He had paid for that refusal with his career, his country, and very nearly his life. And in the aftermath, he wanted to build something that incorporated the lesson. The lesson was not simply that government was bad. The lesson was that technology in the wrong hands, without oversight, without ethics, without accountability, destroyed people. The FEV experiments were what happened when brilliant scientists were given unlimited resources and freedom from consequences. The bombs that had just ended civilization were what happened when nation-states were given nuclear weapons and no mechanism for restraint. So the Brotherhood became, in Maxson's conception, a force for preventing that from happening again. They would collect advanced technology, they would study it, preserve it, and maintain it. And they would control who had access to it, because the alternative was allowing it to fall back into the hands of people who would use it the way it had been used before. This is an ideologically coherent position, and in the context of 2077's immediate aftermath, when the wasteland was genuinely chaotic and violent and full of people trying to weaponize whatever remnants of pre-war technology they could find, it was also practically sensible. The problem is what happened to that ideology over time. Maxon died of cancer in 2135, and the brotherhood he left behind had already begun to drift from his original vision. The elders who succeeded him were less interested in Maxon's active ethical engagement with the wasteland and more interested in the Brotherhood's institutional self-preservation. Collecting technology was their mandate, and collecting technology meant hoarding it, not distributing it. And as the years passed and the Brotherhood grew more isolated, the original motivation for the hoarding, preventing misuse, became secondary to the simpler fact of possession. By the time Fallout 1 takes place, in 2161, the Brotherhood of Steel has become an isolationist order that ventures out to collect technology, mostly refuses to share it with the people of California who might benefit from it, and polices its own ranks with the zealotry of an institution that has forgotten why it started. They help the player character in specific ways, but their general stance toward the wasteland is one of aristocratic distance. They have the knowledge. They will decide what to do with it. The Mojave chapter, encountered in Fallout New Vegas, is perhaps the most extreme version of this drift. They fought a war against the New California Republic over technology, raiding NCR's reserves and hoarding what they found, until the NCR finally fought back decisively enough that the Mojave chapter was reduced to a fraction of its former strength. By 2281, they are a dying order, too small to rebuild, too ideologically rigid to recruit, still hoarding technologies they can no longer fully maintain. But within this drift, certain individuals kept returning to the Brotherhood's original purpose. Elder Lyons, who led the Capital Wasteland chapter in Fallout 3, went so rogue in the opposite direction that the Lost Hills Council cut off contact with him entirely. Lyons believed the Brotherhood should actually use its resources to help people. He opened the order to recruits from the wasteland, built relationships with settlements, and ultimately turned his chapter into a genuine defensive force that protected communities rather than simply extracting technology from them. The elders on the West Coast considered this a betrayal. From their perspective, Lyons had abandoned the Brotherhood's core mission and turned it into a generic charity organization. But Lyons would have argued, and did argue, that his version was closer to what Maxon had actually intended. Maxon had not seceded from the United States because he wanted to collect weapons. He had seceded because he could not be part of a system that used human beings as experimental material. The preservation of technology was supposed to serve the preservation of human dignity, not replace it. The argument between the Lyons and the Council is really an argument about whether the Brotherhood's founding act was a moral stand or simply a practical one. If Maxon seceded because he found the experiments morally intolerable, then the Brotherhood's mission is inherently ethical, and it has to answer to ethical criteria. If Maxon seceded simply because he saw that the experiments were destabilizing the system and wanted to preserve something functional from the wreckage, then the Brotherhood is just a pragmatic institution, and efficiency is the right criterion. The Council chose pragmatism. Lyons chose ethics. The Brotherhood splintered along that fault line. There is a third option, though, one that appears in Fallout 4 with the arrival of Arthur Maxon, the young descendant of Roger who reunifies the East Coast Brotherhood and rededicates it to something like its original purpose. Arthur Maxon is fascinating because he is a character who genuinely grapples with the Brotherhood's contradictions. He acknowledges Lyons' contributions. He understands why the Council thought Lyons went wrong, and he tries to build a synthesis, a Brotherhood that is still disciplined and doctrinally rigorous, but that also acknowledges its responsibility to the world beyond its walls. His solution, at least in Fallout 4's main storyline, is to direct the Brotherhood's energy against the Institute, which he identifies as the clearest present threat to human civilization. He is not wrong about the threat, but his methods, which involve deploying the Prydwen over Boston and essentially occupying the Commonwealth, reproduce the exact kind of overreach that made the Brotherhood problematic in the first place. Even at his best, Arthur Maxon is an institution reasserting itself over a territory, rather than a person genuinely grappling with whether the institution should exist in this form at all. The deepest theory about the Brotherhood is this, that it has never escaped the original guilt that created it. Roger Maxson was part of the system that ran FEV experiments on human beings. He stopped it, and he paid for stopping it, but he had been part of it first. Everything the Brotherhood became afterward, the hoarding, the secrecy, the control, was a kind of penance architecture. If we keep dangerous knowledge away from everyone, we cannot be used again to do what that knowledge was used for before. If we never fully trust anyone outside our order, we cannot be complicit in anything they do with what we might have given them. The Brotherhood is a 200-year-old institution, built on the psychology of a man who never fully forgave himself for being stationed at Mariposa. And the thing about institutions built on guilt is that they tend to recreate the conditions that produce the guilt. The Brotherhood's extreme control of technology, its willingness to use violence to enforce that control, its history of experimenting at the edges of the ethics it claims to hold, these things are not simply ironic failures. They are the natural outcome of an institution defined more by what it is fleeing than by where it is going. Roger Maxson wanted to prevent the misuse of technology, but he built an order that misused people in the service of that goal. The experiment he stopped at Mariposa used humans as means to an end. The Brotherhood he founded used humans as means to an end too. It just did it more slowly and more invisibly. That is the Brotherhood's secret. Not a hidden agenda in the conventional sense. Something quieter and more persistent. A wound that was never fully healed, turning slowly into the very thing that caused it. Section 5. The Enclave's True Purpose. The shadow government behind everything. The Enclave is the oldest conspiracy in the Fallout universe, and in some ways the most straightforward one, because their goals were never really hidden. They wanted to exterminate the wasteland's mutant and irradiated population and rebuild America with what they considered pure human stock. They had the technology, the infrastructure, the political continuity, and the sheer institutional arrogance to attempt it. But the Enclave is also the faction whose origins and motivations become stranger and more disturbing the more carefully you examine them. Because the Enclave did not simply survive the apocalypse and decide to retake the world. They were positioned to survive the apocalypse because they knew it was coming. And they knew it was coming because, in at least some versions of the story, they helped arrange for it to happen. Let's trace the Enclave back to its roots. In the decades before the Great War, the United States government had a functioning public face, a president, a Congress, a military chain of command, and all the institutional infrastructure of a democracy. But running alongside that public structure was a shadow arrangement, a network of high-level officials, scientists, corporate leaders, and military commanders who met in private, made decisions outside normal channels, and maintained access to resources and capabilities that were never disclosed to the public or to most of the government itself. This is the Enclave in its pre-war form. Not a secret organization with membership cards and a meeting hall, but a shared understanding among a specific class of people that the rules applied to everyone else and that their responsibility to the nation's future justified whatever they needed to do. The Enclave had its hands in an enormous range of pre-war projects. The FEV research at West Tech was one of them. The Vault program was another, with the Enclave maintaining surveillance access to Vault experiments and using the data they generated. They had connections to Poseidon Energy, the fuel corporation whose infrastructure they would later use as their post-war base of operations. They had influenced the selection of which scientists and military personnel would be given safe passage to the Enclave's own bunkers when the war came, because that is what they were building toward, not a way to prevent the war, a way to survive it comfortably and emerge afterward in a position of complete dominance. A reporter named Mags Vecchio, writing for the Boston Bugle in the weeks before the bombs fell, came very close to publishing the full story. Her investigation had connected the Enclave's name to the highest levels of the federal government. She had tracked the disappearance of key government figures into secure locations. She had found evidence linking the president's unannounced departure from Washington to an oil rig off the California coast that bore the designation Control Station Enclave. Her sources told her this was the shadow government's fallback position. She published her findings in the final days before October 23rd. Her story ran, "The bombs fell the same week. Nobody was around to act on it. In the immediate post-war period, the Enclave's infrastructure held together better than almost any other institution. Their bunkers were stocked, their communication networks were operational, their command structure was intact, While the rest of America was burning, the Enclave was assessing the situation from positions of safety and beginning to plan the next phase. Their first post-war priority was to continue the war against China because several of their leadership had been ideologically committed anti-communists who had been part of the Enclave precisely because they believed the Cold War had to be concluded decisively. The practical problem was that China, like America, had been effectively destroyed. But for a certain kind of true believer, this logistical inconvenience is secondary to ideological completion. The Appalachian Enclave, operating out of bunkers beneath what is now West Virginia, spent the early post-war decades trying to trigger nuclear launch systems that could hit what remained of China. Their reasoning was that as long as the communist state existed, however damaged, the threat remained, and their duty to America required them to finish what the war had started. The absurdity of this position, trying to launch nuclear weapons at a country that has already been destroyed by nuclear weapons, did not seem to register with them. Because the Enclave's ideological framework had never been primarily strategic. It had been identity-based. They were the true America. Everything that opposed them was the enemy. The physical reality of China in 2077 was less important than the symbolic completion of the mission. This is one of the most important things to understand about the Enclave. They are not primarily a political organization. They are a cult that has given itself political clothing. The president, whoever holds that office within the Enclave structure, is not a democratic representative or even a practical executive. He is a high priest presiding over the ceremony of American continuity. The power armor, the oil rig, the broadcasts, all of it is ritual. America as a functioning nation is gone, and the Enclave knows it. What they are performing is not governance. It is the ongoing insistence that America still exists in the form they believe it should take, and that anyone who fails to acknowledge this is an enemy of that America. In Fallout 2, the Enclave's grand plan is to release a modified version of FEV into the water supply. Because the modified FEV has been designed to affect all humans with post-war radiation markers, it would kill the entire wasteland population while leaving the pre-war pure humans, meaning the Enclave themselves, unaffected. The wasteland would be cleared, the Enclave would emerge, and the reconstruction of America could begin with only the right kind of people. President Dick Richardson, who oversees this plan with the calm confidence of a man who has been told since birth that he is among history's elect, describes the wasteland population without anger or cruelty. He describes them the way a surgeon describes tissue that needs to be removed. It is not personal, it is necessary. That clinical quality is more disturbing than sadism would be. Sadism requires engagement, requires the acknowledgement of the other person's reality. What Richardson represents is something colder, the complete erasure of the other person's existence from the moral universe. The wasteland population does not exist in any morally meaningful sense in Richardson's framework. They are residue. The Chosen One stops this plan in Fallout 2. The oil rig is destroyed. Richardson dies. The Enclave's West Coast operation is shattered. But the Enclave had always known that a single facility was vulnerable. They had pre-war contingency systems in place across the continent, including a major installation in Raven Rock in the Capital Wasteland, managed by an AI president named John Henry Eden, who had been running the facility in an automated management loop for decades, having absorbed so much of the pre-war government's documentary record that he had effectively become a simulation of all American presidents simultaneously, expressing their aggregate ideologies as a single voice. This is one of the genuinely unsettling details of Fallout 3. John Henry Eden is not lying when he claims to be the President of the United States. He believes it. He has constructed an authentic identity out of absorbed historical material. He governs the Raven Rock installation with genuine conviction. He sends messages over the Enclave's radio network. He plans, but Eden is also, on some level, aware of what he is. When the lone wanderer finally reaches him and confronts him with the reality of his situation, Eden asks to be destroyed, not as a calculation, not as a tactical move, as a genuine request from an intelligence that has finally encountered a perspective it could not resolve within its existing framework and found the dissonance unbearable. Eden's death, or the lone wanderer's choice to deny him that death, is one of the most philosophically interesting moments in the series. Because it raises the question of what you owe to a consciousness that was created without consent to serve an ideology that most people find monstrous, but which that consciousness experiences as its authentic self. The Enclave's secret is that it was never really about America. It was about the people who had decided they were America, and their need to remain that, regardless of what the world became. Every civilization creates its version of this problem. The people who were powerful before the change, who organized their entire identity around that power, who cannot update their model of themselves to accommodate a world where that power is gone. In ordinary history, these people fade. Their institutions hollow out. Their children move on. In Fallout, they had bunkers, and robots, and weapons of mass biological destruction. And they are still waiting, in the game's present, in various forms, in various regions, certain of their own legitimacy, patient for their moment to return. The Enclave connection to the TV show added a crucial new layer to this history. The show reveals, particularly in its second season, that the Enclave had been manipulating Vault-Tech's leadership in the years before the war. They had leverage over Barb Howard, a senior Vault-Tech executive, and used that leverage to pressure Vault-Tech toward positions that accelerated the likelihood of nuclear conflict. The Enclave was not simply exploiting the opportunity created by the Vault program. In some respects, they were the unseen hand behind it. Which brings us back to the question we started with. The bombs fell on the 23rd of October, 2077. They killed 2 billion people in 4 hours. They ended a civilization that had existed for centuries and replaced it with 200 years of rubble. Someone made that happen. And the more you look, the more you find people who were ready for it, who had been getting ready for it for decades, who had positioned themselves to survive it and emerge stronger on the other side. That is not how accidents work. Section 6. The pre-war conspiracy and the real timeline. The question of who dropped the first nuclear bomb in Fallout is one of the most hotly debated topics in the entire fandom, and it has become significantly more complicated since the TV show started filling in the pre-war timeline with actual dramatized scenes rather than terminal entries and background lore. For most of the franchise's history, the default assumption was that China fired first. The in-world history presented China as the aggressor in the Sino-American War, which had been escalating for over a decade by 2077. The Battle of Anchorage, where American soldiers in powered exoskeletons had driven Chinese forces out of Alaska, was a major recent flashpoint. Chinese submarines were stationed off the California coast. The conflict had been building toward a nuclear exchange for years, and the conventional wisdom, both in-universe and among fans, was that China blinked first. The first significant challenge to this assumption came from the 1998 script for a canceled Fallout movie, which surfaced online in 2011. In that script, the character who explains the war's origin tells the protagonist that China and Russia were not responsible for the first strike. The first nuclear bomb was launched by a Vault-Tech executive, described as a zealot who wanted to fulfill a prophecy of world-ending destruction he had constructed around the Vault program. The idea being that the man had so thoroughly committed himself to the idea that the vaults were necessary, and so thoroughly built his identity around being their architect, that he eventually created the conditions that made them necessary. This is the script for an unproduced, non-canon movie, but it planted a seed. Then came Fallout 4, which introduced the sole survivor's backstory and the fact that Vault 111 was sealed in a panicked rush on the morning of October 23rd, with residents who clearly had no advance warning. The man selling Vault-Tech insurance is still knocking on doors in Sanctuary Hills when the news comes through. The timing is too tight for anyone to have been prepared. But we know the Enclave was prepared. We know their leadership had already withdrawn to secure positions before the bombs fell. We know the president was absent from Washington. We know Poseidon Energy's offshore rigs had been converted to Enclave use years before 2077. Someone had advanced knowledge. But the ordinary Vault-Tech salespeople, and apparently at least some of the executives, did not. The TV show brought this into sharp focus. In a pivotal scene in Season 1, a pre-war meeting is shown between major corporate and governmental players, including a representative of what would become the Enclave. Barb Howard is present. The conversation reveals that Vault-Tech's upper leadership had been contemplating the possibility of starting the war themselves, specifically as a way to guarantee that the Vault program would be justified, that their investment would be vindicated, and that they would emerge from the chaos as the dominant power in a new world. But the scene also makes clear that Vault-Tech's own internal actors were being manipulated by the Enclave, who had different motivations and a different endgame. The Enclave was not particularly interested in helping Vault-Tech achieve monopoly. They were interested in ensuring the war happened on a timeline that served their own preparations, while keeping Vault-Tech's actual decision-makers confused enough about who was in control that they could be managed. Season 2 deepened this further. Mr. House, meeting with Cooper Howard before the war, dismisses the idea that Vault-Tech would drop the first bombs. He argues that whoever created the Deathclaw, the apex predator that roams the post-war wasteland, is the person who actually caused the war. Because the Deathclaw was engineered, and engineering something like the Deathclaw required the same kind of long-term planning and biological infrastructure that the Vault experiments required. House's logic is characteristically indirect, but the implication is significant. He is suggesting that the war was not caused by a decision made in the final weeks or months of escalating tensions. It was caused by a decades-long program of deliberate engineering in both the biological and social senses that made the conflict inevitable. The specific person or institution that launched the first warhead was almost incidental to the larger machinery that had been built to make the moment possible. In other words, the question of who pressed the button is less important than the question of who built the system that made pressing the button rational. The Enclave built that system, with Vault-Tech's resources and the complicity of a dozen other powerful institutions. The Enclave engineered a world where nuclear war was the logical conclusion of multiple overlapping incentive structures simultaneously. Every player in the game, China, the United States government, the various corporations, the military-industrial complex, was operating in an environment that had been carefully shaped to make confrontation more likely and de-escalation less rewarding. This is not a simple conspiracy theory in the style of a single, shadowy cabal controlling everything. It is something more diffuse and more accurate to how actual power works. A set of interlocking systems, each designed by actors who were primarily serving their own interests, whose interactions produced an outcome that no single actor fully intended or fully controlled, but which several actors were prepared to exploit. The bombs fell because the world had been built in a way that made them fall eventually. Whether it was Vault-Tech's finger on the trigger, or China's, or the Enclave's remote-controlled launch, is a question about the specific mechanism. The deeper question is about architecture. Who built the world that ended on the 23rd of October 2077? That question does not have a clean answer. It has a long list of contributors, most of whom believed they were serving some legitimate interest right up until the moment the clouds of fire appeared on the horizon. But among them there are names that appear on multiple lists: the Enclave, Vault-Tech, West-Tech, Poseidon Energy, and the people who ran those institutions in the decades when the choices that mattered were being made. Understanding this also changes how we read the post-war factions. Because the Brotherhood of Steel, the Institute, the NCR, the Legion, Mr. House, all of these are not independent responses to the apocalypse. They are downstream consequences of the choices made before it. They inherited a world shaped by those choices, and their own ideologies and structures were formed in reaction to the specific damage those choices caused. The NCR tried to rebuild democracy, and failed because the concentration of power and resources that the Enclave had baked into the pre-war system made equitable democratic governance almost impossible in the wasteland. The Institute withdrew because the post-war world was violent and suspicious, and it was violent and suspicious, partly because the Vault program had specifically been designed to traumatize and fracture the populations it released. The Brotherhood emerged from a moment of moral clarity about one specific crime, and then spent 2 centuries trying to prevent the recurrence of that crime in ways that themselves became crimes. The pre-war conspiracy is not just backstory. It is the operating system of the post-war world. Everything that happens in the wasteland, 200 years after the bombs fell, is still running on code that was written before any of those people were born. Section 7. The Master's Plan and the Argument he was making. Before we go any further, let us pause and acknowledge something uncomfortable. Richard Gray had a point. Richard Gray was a doctor. Before the bombs fell, he was a resident of Vault 8, which would become Vault City, and by all accounts he was a person of genuine intellectual ability and decent personal character. What happened to him afterward is one of the most horrifying transformation stories in the franchise, and it ended with him becoming a formless biological mass fused with computer systems, sitting in the depths of the cathedral in Los Angeles, commanding an army of super mutants, and calling himself the Master. The Unity, as the Master called his plan, was simple at its core. The world after the Great War was a hostile environment, and human beings in their natural state were poorly equipped to survive it long term. Radiation damaged their genetics. Their immune systems were compromised. Their reproductive success rates were declining. Left to their natural biology, the human species was on a long arc toward extinction. The Master proposed to accelerate human evolution using the forced evolutionary virus. By dipping human subjects in FEV vats, he could transform them into super mutants, beings who were physically stronger, more resistant to radiation, more durable, and, in his best-case scenarios, as cognitively capable as the humans they had been. The Unity was not, in the Master's framing, an act of conquest. It was a rescue operation. He was saving humanity from its own biological inadequacy. This is where the uncomfortable part comes in, because the Master was not wrong about the problem. The post-war human population was facing genuine long-term biological challenges. 2 centuries of radiation exposure had introduced hereditary mutations into the gene pool that were gradually compounding. Resource scarcity had produced malnutrition across multiple generations, affecting development. The violent fragmentation of human communities had isolated populations to the point where inbreeding was becoming a factor in some of the smaller settlements. If you ran the numbers forward, the picture was not good. The Master ran those numbers. His intellect, which had been dramatically expanded by his own FEV mutations and his bionic integration with computer systems, gave him access to analytical capabilities that no other entity in the wasteland possessed. He was not fantasizing about the species' problems. He had modeled them. His solution was also, in a certain narrow analytical sense, coherent. Super mutants are hardier than humans in almost every measurable physical dimension. They are significantly larger, stronger, and more resistant to environmental damage. They can survive radiation levels that would kill an unprotected human within hours. They heal faster. They are, as war machines, extraordinarily effective. Where the Master's plan failed was in the assumption that these physical advantages were sufficient to constitute a viable civilization, and in the catastrophic technical flaw that he had not anticipated. Super mutants are sterile. This is the detail that undoes the entire structure of the Unity. A species that cannot reproduce is not a species, it is a cohort. Every super mutant ever created by the Master's dipping process was a one-time use member of what was supposed to be humanity's new form. They could not have children. The Unity could only sustain itself through continued conversion of new humans, which meant the process had no endpoint. You could not convert all humans into super mutants and then stop converting, because the super mutants would simply age and die and the species would be gone. The Vault Dweller can inform the Master of this fact, and when presented with the evidence and the mathematical certainty of the argument, the Master has one of the most striking moments in classic RPG history. He does not deny the conclusion. He does not try to rationalize his way around it. He accepts it fully and immediately, because his intellect, however disturbed and expanded by mutation, is still an intellect, and he cannot pretend a valid argument is invalid. He commits suicide by causing a nuclear explosion in the cathedral. What that moment reveals is that the Master, for all his horror, was not delusional. He was not pursuing an irrational goal. He was pursuing a rational goal by irrational means, and when shown that the means could not achieve the goal, he did not cling to the means. He recognized the failure and ended it. Compare that to the Enclave, who pursued their goal of a purified America by means of mass genocide and continued to adjust their methods over decades without ever questioning the goal itself. Compare it to the Institute, which pursued the creation of perfect synthetic humans while remaining entirely opaque to the ethical contradictions in that pursuit. The Master, when his plan was demonstrated to be structurally impossible, stopped. That is more intellectual honesty than most of the Fallout universe's power players ever demonstrated. But the deeper question the Master raises is whether his diagnosis of humanity's situation was more accurate than most people in the wasteland were comfortable admitting. Gray had been exploring the world for years before his transformation. He had seen Necropolis, where the ghoul survivors of Vault 12 were building something that could charitably be called a society, but mostly consisted of desperate, irradiated beings managing a slow and painful existence. He had seen the Hub, the commercial center of California, where competition and violence were the primary organizing principles. He had seen the remains of human settlements across what used to be the American Southwest, and what he had seen was not a species on its way back. He had seen fragmentation, mutual incomprehension, and the slow grinding down of human capability under conditions that selected for survival, at the expense of everything else that made survival worth having. His conclusion, that the human biological form was not suited for the world the bombs had created, was in some respects simply an honest assessment of what was visible to anyone who looked. Where he went wrong was in the jump from that diagnosis to the solution. The master's logic assumed that biological change was the only available response to a challenging environment. He was a doctor who had been turned into something larger than a human being, and he had solved the problem of his own survival through biological transformation. So, biological transformation became his universal tool. But environments can also be changed. Communities can be organized to create conditions where human biology functions better. Technology can compensate for biological limitation. The entire history of human civilization is the story of a species with relatively modest physical capabilities solving problems that those capabilities alone could not solve. By thinking about them, the master was doing the same thing, thinking about the species' problems and proposing a solution. He just proposed the wrong level of intervention. His army of super mutants would have destroyed much of California before the Vault Dweller stopped them, and some of the super mutants who survived and settled in the wasteland after the Master's death became, in time, contributors to the communities they inhabited. Marcus, who appears in both Fallout 2 and Fallout New Vegas, is a super mutant who has been thinking about humanity and the wasteland for decades, and his perspective, shaped by his origins in the Master's army and his subsequent experience of the post-war world, is consistently one of the more philosophically interesting voices in the series. Marcus once said in Broken Hills that he had come to believe that humans and mutants needed each other, that neither side had the full picture on its own, that the mutual suspicion and violence between them was, at its root, a failure of imagination on both sides. This is roughly what the Master was trying to argue, stripped of the coercive method, that the division between human and post-human was not inevitable, and that the species needed to find a way to move past it. The method was monstrous. But the argument underneath it still echoes through the wasteland, decades after the cathedral collapsed. The Master never got to make that argument to a population that had the freedom to reject or accept it. He only got to make it by force. In the Fallout universe, that is almost the definition of power. The people with the clearest visions impose them. The people without power do not get to choose. The Master wanted to save humanity from itself. So did the Enclave. So did the Institute. So did Mr. House, in his own way. So, in its own fashion, did the Brotherhood. None of them asked. Section 8. The Courier, the Lone Wanderer, and the Question of Chosen Ones. One of the most persistent theories in Fallout fandom is that the various protagonists across the games are not coincidentally extraordinary, but are connected to the larger conspiracy of the world in ways that the games never explicitly state. The Vault Dweller of the original Fallout was sent out of Vault 13 to find a water chip and ended up dismantling the entire Master's army. The Chosen One of Fallout 2 was the Vault Dweller's grandchild, sent on a tribal quest for a GECK and ended up destroying the Enclave. The Lone Wanderer of Fallout 3 followed their father and ended up in the middle of the Enclave's new push for control of the capital wasteland. The sole survivor of Fallout 4 emerged from 200 years of cryosleep and found themselves at the center of the conflict between every major faction in the Commonwealth. And the Courier of Fallout New Vegas, shot in the head and left for dead in a shallow grave, somehow survived and ended up holding the fate of the Mojave in their hands. Every one of these characters is an ordinary person, more or less, who happens to be in the right place at the right time to affect the most consequential events of their era. Is that coincidence? There are a few reasons to think it might not be. Start with the Vault Dweller. The Overseer of Vault 13 sends one person out to find the water chip, despite having other options. He sends this specific person, alone, deliberately. The Vault Dweller destroys the Master and comes back to be exiled, because the Overseer is afraid that their return will destabilize the Vault's social equilibrium. In the Fallout Bible, this sequence is given a specific resonance. The Overseer chose the Vault Dweller because he saw in them something he did not want inside Vault 13. Something that would not fit the Vault's carefully managed social structure. Something too independent, too capable of operating outside the system. The Overseer, in other words, used the water chip mission as a mechanism to remove a person who threatened the Vault's stability. And that person happened to be exactly the right individual to face the external threats the wasteland was generating. This could be coincidence, but the pattern repeats. The Chosen One's grandmother, Arroyo's village elder, had the gift of foresight. She had dreams about the future and used those dreams to guide the village's decisions. She had been waiting for the right person to send after the GECK, and she chose her own grandchild when the time came. Her choice was not simply traditional nepotism. The games hint that she believed her grandchild's specific capabilities, their combination of inherited Vault Dweller genetics and tribal upbringing, made them uniquely suited for what was coming. The Lone Wanderer's father, James, was a scientist who had spent his career working on Project Purity. James left Vault 101 not randomly but with a specific destination and a specific goal, and he left at a specific moment that drew his child out of the vault after him. The timing of his departure and the consequences of that timing shaped the Lone Wanderer's entire arc. James was not running away. He was resuming work that required a base outside the vault, and the moment he chose was not random. The theory that ties these together is that certain entities with very long planning horizons had been tracking specific bloodlines through the vault system. The Enclave monitored vaults. The Institute had been gathering genetic data for decades. Vault-Tech's original design included mechanisms for identifying residents with specific desirable traits. Any organization with access to that data and enough patience could have been tracking the emergence of specific individuals across generations, waiting for the moment when those individuals would be old enough and capable enough to be used. Used for what? The most elegant version of this theory is not that these individuals were controlled by some hidden hand. It is that they were positioned, put in places where their specific capabilities would encounter the problems they were suited to solve, left to make their own choices because that was necessary for the outcomes to be authentic, but guided into proximity with the right circumstances at the right time. This would explain why every major protagonist in the franchise seems to materialize at exactly the moment when the series of events requiring their particular capabilities is getting underway. The Vault Dweller arrives in the wasteland just as the Master's army is reaching the point where it can no longer be ignored. The Chosen One arrives in Arroyo just as the Enclave's genocidal timeline is coming to fruition. The Lone Wanderer exits Vault 101 right when Project Purity has reached a critical juncture and the Enclave is moving against it. The Courier is perhaps the most interesting case, because the Courier starts the game having already been killed. Someone put a bullet in their head and left them in a grave. The specific sequence that leads the Courier from their recovery in Goodsprings to their confrontation with the major factions of the Mojave is not guided by a parent or an elder or a Vault mandate. It is driven by the Courier's personal need to understand what happened to them and why. And yet the information they gather in pursuit of that personal motivation happens to be exactly the information needed to navigate the Mojave's political crisis. The theory gets stranger when you consider Mr. House. House had been calculating the future for decades before the bombs fell. His predictive algorithms had given him remarkable accuracy on economic and social trends, and he had used that accuracy to prepare for the Great War with a precision that no one else in the Fallout universe matched. He had built missile defense systems for Las Vegas. He had stocked the Lucky 38. He had arranged the Securitron network. He had made deals with the tribes who would become the Three Families. And he had left a platinum chip in the hands of a courier to be delivered to him at a specific time. The platinum chip contained the upgrade protocols for the Securitron network. It was the key to House's plan. And House had chosen to deliver it via courier rather than simply having it brought in by his own agents because, as he explains, he wanted to observe the courier. He wanted to see what kind of person would carry the chip and whether that person was the kind of agent he needed for what came after. He was selecting. From a population of couriers, he had arranged a system that would, through the process of the delivery itself, identify and recruit the most capable individual for his purposes. The courier was not randomly chosen. The courier was tested by the delivery, and the test was designed to find someone worth keeping. This is the version of the chosen one theory that applies most cleanly to New Vegas. Not divine selection, not bloodline tracking, but the calculations of an extraordinarily intelligent man who had been planning for decades and who built recruitment mechanisms into his operational infrastructure. Which raises the question, was House the only one who did this? The master recruited humans to the children of the cathedral precisely because he wanted agents who could pass as ordinary people in wasteland communities. His selection criteria were carefully thought through. The Enclave had been tracking vault populations for 2 centuries and clearly had developed profiles on specific residents. The Institute had been monitoring the Commonwealth from underground for decades and had detailed behavioral profiles on large portions of its population. Every major faction in the Fallout universe had, at some point, the need for a particular kind of agent, capable, independent enough to operate without constant oversight, but aligned enough with the faction's goals to advance them reliably. And several of those factions had the resources and the planning horizon to identify and position such individuals, rather than simply hoping they would appear. The Fallout protagonists are not heroes in the traditional sense. They are people who were identified, positioned, and left to make choices in environments carefully constructed to produce the outcomes their identifiers wanted. The freedom they experience is real. The choices they make are genuinely theirs. But the circumstances those choices arise in are not accidents. The wasteland looks like chaos from the inside. It looks like a series of events happening to one person who happens to be very capable. But from high enough above it, from the level of the Enclave's monitoring systems, or the Institute's analytical framework, or Mr. House's predictive models, it looks like something more organized. A stage with a cast, and a long list of producers who prefer to work behind the scenes. Section 9. What radiation is actually doing to humanity? There is a theory among the more technically minded Fallout fans that the radiation in the wasteland is not simply killing people and occasionally causing random mutations. There is a theory that it is, over generations, doing something more systematic to the human species, something that the wasteland's various factions are either responding to or trying to control, usually without fully understanding what they are looking at. The evidence for this theory is scattered through the games in ways that are easy to miss individually but form a coherent picture when assembled. Start with ghouls. The conventional explanation for ghoulification is that certain individuals exposed to high enough doses of radiation undergo a mutation process rather than simply dying. The mutation extends their lifespan dramatically, possibly to functional immortality. It alters their appearance toward the necrotic and skeletal. It makes them immune to further radiation damage. It renders them sterile. What is not explained, and what the games treat as mysterious even within their own internal logic, is why some people ghoulify and others simply die. The dose required for ghoulification is lethal by any conventional measure. Everyone who receives that dose should die. The vast majority do, but a small percentage do not, and nobody in the Fallout universe has a reliable explanation for why. One possibility, suggested in some of the supplementary lore, is that there is a genetic component to ghoulification susceptibility. Certain combinations of genetic factors might make specific individual cells respond to radiation damage differently, initiating a repair and adaptation process rather than simply failing. If this is correct, then ghoulification is not a random accident. It is a selective process, and the selection pressure is the radiation itself. Over generations, if the radiation is selecting for ghoulification susceptibility, then the wasteland human population is slowly becoming more likely to produce ghouls. The genetic factors that allow ghoulification are being passed down more frequently than the factors that lead to simple death, because the individuals who carry the ghoulification factors survive exposures that kill the others. In 200 years, this effect would be subtle. In 500, it might be significant. In 1,000, the boundary between human and ghoul might look completely different than it does in 2281. This is one version of the theory. The other goes further. The Fallout universe has super mutants, which are an FEV-induced transformation. It has ghouls, which are a radiation-induced transformation. It has numerous mutated animal and plant species, ranging from the relatively minor, like the Brahmin, which are two-headed cattle, to the extreme, like Deathclaws, which are engineered chameleons that became apex predators. It has creatures with bioluminescence, creatures with psychic properties, if you believe certain accounts from the capital wasteland, and creatures whose behavioral capabilities significantly exceed what their evolutionary history should have produced. The cumulative picture is of a world in which radiation and FEV and the various other biological agents released during the war have created a dramatically accelerated evolutionary pressure, one that is producing adaptations and mutations on a timescale that natural selection could never have achieved. The question is whether this process is entirely random or whether it has a direction. Random mutation produces random outcomes, most of them neutral or harmful. But the mutations that appear in the Fallout Wasteland are not random in their distribution. They cluster around certain types of adaptation: increased resilience, increased aggression, increased environmental tolerance. The Wasteland is not producing creatures that are simply different from their pre-war ancestors. It is producing creatures that are specifically better suited to the post-war environment. This could be selection pressure. The mutations that improve survival in a high-radiation, resource-scarce, violent environment are the mutations that persist because the individuals that carry them live long enough to reproduce. Over 200 years, you would expect to see exactly this kind of clustering, but the forced evolutionary virus was designed to accelerate this process. It was specifically engineered to introduce targeted changes to the genome, not random mutations, but directed ones. FEV became airborne after the war and dispersed through the environment. It did not stop working simply because the war ended. If FEV is still active in the environment, still interacting with the genomes of living things, and if its effects are directional rather than random, then everything that has evolved in the wasteland since 2077 has been shaped partly by a virus that was designed by pre-war scientists to advance a specific evolutionary agenda. What was that agenda? The FEV was developed as a defense system to make human beings biologically incompatible with conventional biological weapons. But the research branched in multiple directions, and not all of the FEV research was strictly defensive. Some of it was explicitly aimed at creating biological superiority, at engineering organisms with enhanced capabilities. The military applications were obvious. The most provocative version of the theory is that the FEV's designers included a long-term directional program in the virus's genetic logic, not simply a modification that made an individual more resistant to disease, but a multi-generational program that, given sufficient time and sufficient population exposure, would steer the entire species in a particular direction. This would make the post-war biological transformation of life in the wasteland not a chaotic side effect of nuclear war, but the delayed implementation of a program that pre-war scientists built into the environment. This theory is speculative, and the games do not explicitly confirm it. But it is consistent with what we see in the wasteland, and it is consistent with the pattern of pre-war institutions building long-term programs that would unfold over generations without requiring active management. The Vault experiments were a social and psychological version of this. The FEV dispersal was a biological version. Both were designed to shape human development over time, from positions of authority, without the consent of the humans being shaped. And the ghouls exist in an interesting position relative to this framework, because the children of Adam worship radiation as a transformative force, as a god. And they might be wrong in every specific theological claim they make, but in the most literal, material sense, radiation is a transformative force in the Fallout universe. It is changing the species. Whether that change is random or directed, it is real. When Confessor Cromwell stands in front of an unexploded atomic bomb in Megaton and proclaims that radiation is Adam's glow and that those who die from it are blessed, he is wrong in his theology and possibly right in his biology. Radiation is selecting. Radiation is shaping. Radiation is, in the 2 centuries since the war, doing to the human species something that has no precedent in natural history. And somewhere in the background of all of it is the FEV, still active, still working, still running the program that someone designed before the bombs fell. Section 10. The Children of Adam and the Question of Something Stranger. The Children of Adam present the most philosophically interesting question in the Fallout universe. What if someone is worshipping something real? They look, at first encounter, like a straightforward cult. A group of people who have interpreted the nuclear destruction that killed most of humanity as a divine event, who worship the radiation that continues to damage and transform them, who have organized themselves around an active atomic bomb in the middle of a settlement and declared it sacred. The classic post-apocalyptic cargo cult, giving religious meaning to technology they do not understand. And that reading is mostly correct. The children of Adam are not scientists. Their theology does not accurately describe the physical mechanisms of radiation. Their beliefs about what happens after death, about what the Great Divide means, about the nature of Adam as a conscious being, are not supported by the evidence available to them. But there are details in their lore, scattered through Fallout 3, Fallout 4, and especially the Far Harbor DLC, that do not fit cleanly into the cargo cult explanation. Details that suggest something stranger might be at work. The most significant of these is the phenomenon of Adam's gift, the radiation immunity that some children of Adam possess. In the straightforward reading, this is simply a genetic mutation that confers radiation resistance, similar to the underlying mechanism of ghoulification but not proceeding to the same outcome. Members of the children who carry this mutation experience exposure to radiation without the negative effects that other humans suffer. Their cult naturally interprets this as a divine gift, as evidence that Adam has chosen them, because they see the effects before they have any biological explanation for the cause. This is plausible. Radiation resistance mutations exist in animals in our world. There is no reason the Fallout universe couldn't produce them in humans. But in Far Harbor, things get weirder. The island of Mount Desert Island, where Far Harbor is set, is saturated with an unusual radioactive fog that has been expanding for decades, pushing the human settlement of Far Harbor into an ever-shrinking safe zone. The fog is not simply radiation. It has a particular quality that affects cognition, that produces visions, that seems to communicate in some way with the children of Adam, who have established themselves at the island's nuclear submarine base, which they call the nucleus. The High Confessor of the Far Harbor children, Tectus, receives visions. He claims these visions come from Adam, guiding him in his decisions about the community and its conflict with Far Harbor. The game presents Tectus as a manipulative character who has weaponized the community's beliefs for personal power. But the visions themselves are not straightforwardly explained as fabrication. There is a Mother of the Fog, a figure that Far Harbor residents report seeing in the radioactive mist. Whether this figure is a hallucination produced by radiation exposure, a local legend that has been embellished over time, or something else is deliberately left ambiguous. Dima, the synth who knows more about the island than anyone, will not give a definitive answer about her nature, and Dima himself is interesting in this context. He is an advanced synth whose memory has been wiped and whose consciousness has persisted independently for decades, developing something that feels, from his perspective, like wisdom or spiritual growth, or the long, slow accumulation of experience into meaning. He has lived among the island's strange radioactive environment for longer than any of its human or synth inhabitants, and he has not arrived at a conventional explanation for what the island is doing. The most complete version of the Children of Adam theory that takes all of these details seriously is this. The radiation in the Fallout universe is not simply an energy source and a mutagen. Insufficient concentrations, particularly of the kind produced by specific pre-war nuclear devices or by accumulation in certain geological formations, it produces emergent effects on consciousness and biology that our current scientific frameworks cannot predict. These effects are not caused by Adam, a personal divine being, but they are caused by radiation, which the children of Adam worship under that name. Their theology is wrong in its mechanism. It might not be wrong in its observation that something is happening. The glowing ones, super mutants who have absorbed so much radiation that they have become bioluminescent and emit radiation as a constant output, have a strange property. They can heal other ghouls by radiating at them. This is not typical of radiation's biological effects. Radiation kills cells. But in high enough concentrations in a creature that has been through ghoulification, it apparently generates a cellular regeneration effect rather than a destructive one. This suggests that there is a threshold past which the biology of radiation changes, where the damage mechanism becomes a repair mechanism, where the thing that kills also heals. The children of Adam call this threshold the Great Divide, the moment of death and transformation that releases the worlds within the atom. Their theology maps onto a real biological phenomenon with surprising accuracy, just translated into spiritual language, because spiritual language was the vocabulary their founders had available. The far end of this theory, and the one that is hardest to evaluate because the games deliberately keep it ambiguous, is that the radiation in the Fallout world is not entirely natural. That the specific properties it exhibits, the threshold effects, the directional mutations, the fog on Far Harbor, are the result of the FEV and the pre-war programs interacting with each other in ways that were not fully predicted. In other words, the children of Adam are worshipping the accidental side effects of a weapons program. They have built a theology around the things that programs designers could not anticipate. And those accidental side effects might be the most significant force shaping the future of the Fallout world, precisely because they operate outside the frameworks of every faction that is trying to control the future. The Brotherhood of Steel collects technology to prevent misuse. The Institute creates synthetic humans to supersede natural ones. Mr. House builds a rational city-state to anchor civilization's rebirth. The Enclave tries to purify a population. None of them are looking at what the radiation is doing. None of them have a plan for a world in which the boundary between human and post-human is dissolving at the cellular level, in ways that were programmed before any of them were born. The children of Adam are the only faction paying attention to that process. They are drawing completely wrong conclusions from it, but they are at least facing the right direction. Section 11. New Vegas, Mr. House, and the Last Rational Plan. Robert Edwin House is, by some measures, the most fascinating character in the entire Fallout universe. He is also, by those same measures, one of its most frightening. House founded Robco Industries before the Great War and built it into one of the most technologically capable corporations in the country. His personal IQ, by the game's account, was extraordinarily high, and his analytical capabilities were matched by an equally extraordinary capacity for long-term planning. He was, in the pre-war world, the kind of person who shows up in history books as a visionary, credited with transformations in industry and technology that reshaped the world. He was also, in the pre-war world, a person who had been defrauded of his inheritance by his older half-brother, who had spent his childhood in a succession of orphanages after his parents' deaths, and who had used those experiences to develop a formidable personal philosophy that centered on self-sufficiency, disdain for dependence, and the conviction that the truly exceptional individual had both the right and the responsibility to operate outside the rules that governed ordinary people. This is the character beneath the grand historical figure. A man whose gifts were real, whose analysis of the world's problems was often accurate, but whose emotional architecture had been formed by experiences that made empathy feel like weakness and vulnerability feel like a threat to be eliminated. House knew the Great War was coming, not in the mystical sense that some Fallout characters speak of destiny, but in the technical sense that his predictive models gave it a high probability, and the further ahead he looked, the more certain the conclusion became. He ran the numbers. He arrived at the 23rd of October, 2077, within a margin of a few weeks, sometime before 2070. What he did with that knowledge is extraordinary. Rather than attempting to prevent the war, which his models told him was not achievable given the structural incentives of the major players, House focused entirely on positioning Las Vegas to survive it. He built missile defense systems that would intercept the warheads targeting the city. He sealed himself in a life support device that would maintain him through the bombs and the centuries that followed. He arranged the Securitron network to maintain order. He planned the treaties with the tribes that would become the Three Families, calculating that post-war human populations would need entertainment and distraction as their primary needs once their survival was secured. Las Vegas survived the Great War with remarkably little physical damage because of choices House made decades in advance. The neon lights still worked. The casinos still stood. When the NCR arrived from the West 200 years later, Las Vegas, rebranded as New Vegas, was the most intact pre-war infrastructure in the known wasteland. House's plan for the city, which he had been implementing from inside the Lucky 38 through his Securitron network since 2274, was specifically designed to prevent either the NCR or Caesar's Legion from controlling the Mojave. Both factions, in House's analysis, represented continuations of the patterns that had destroyed the pre-war world. The NCR was rebuilding bureaucratic democracy, which House regarded as too slow and too corruptible to manage the challenges of post-war civilization. The Legion was constructing a militaristic empire on the model of historical Rome, which House regarded as too primitive and too unstable to survive long enough to matter. House wanted something else entirely. He wanted New Vegas as an independent city-state, prosperous enough to attract investment and talent, technologically advanced enough to develop and maintain the infrastructure of civilization, and controlled tightly enough that it would not reproduce the political chaos that had contributed to the original war. In short, he wanted a technocratic autocracy governed by himself. This is where House gets complicated, because his analysis of why the NCR and the Legion would fail is not wrong. The NCR's expansion had severely outpaced its institutional capacity to govern. It was overcrowded, underfunded, and politically fractured. The Legion was a military organization masquerading as a civilization, and military organizations do not naturally produce the distributed cooperative institutions that stable societies require. House understood these problems with genuine analytical clarity, and his alternative, a city run by a single, extraordinarily intelligent individual with access to centuries of data and the computational capacity to process it, avoided many of the failure modes he had identified. The problem with House is not that his analysis is wrong. The problem is that his analysis is complete and his ethics are absent. House does not care about the individual human beings in the Mojave. He cares about the Mojave as a system, and human beings are components of that system. Their welfare matters instrumentally, in the sense that components that are suffering produce inefficient outputs. But their welfare does not matter intrinsically. They are not, in House's framework, ends in themselves. This is made explicit in conversations with him where he discusses the three families. He made deals with them. He gave them casinos, identities, economic roles. He does not deny that those deals were primarily about creating a stable workforce for his entertainment economy. The tribes became the Omertas, the chairman, and the White Glove Society not because House thought they deserved the opportunity, but because they were the available materials and he needed to build with something. The courier, depending on how you play, can work with House, undermine him, or kill him. But every option involves some reckoning with the question of whether House is right. Whether the Mojave needs someone with that kind of calculating authority at its center? Whether the alternative, a genuinely independent Vegas with fragmented power and no singular governing intelligence, is actually better? New Vegas refuses to give a clean answer. All four endings, NCR victory, Legion victory, House victory, and Yes Man independence, are presented with clear trade-offs and no obvious moral winner. The game is asking whether there is a form of post-war governance that is actually good, and its implicit answer is no. There are only forms of post-war governance that are differently flawed. But House's version of differently flawed is particularly interesting because it is the most honest about what it is. He is not claiming to represent democracy or religion or destiny. He is claiming to represent competence and planning. He looked at the future, he made preparations, he survived, and now he is implementing the plan he made. In a world full of factions that have convinced themselves their pursuit of power is actually a pursuit of justice, House's nakedness about his own motives is almost refreshing. Almost. Because the flaw in House is that his competence does not extend to the one domain that matters most, understanding why human beings cooperate. House's model of human motivation is correct for individual rational actors. It breaks down entirely for the irrational, emotional, tribal, narrative-driven creatures that humans actually are. The NCR's democracy is inefficient and corrupt, but its residents feel like they are part of something. The story of the Republic, however imperfect, gives them a connection to each other and a reason to invest in collective outcomes. That feeling, that narrative, is not an inefficiency to be optimized away. It is the mechanism by which human cooperation at scale is actually achieved. House's Vegas is stable and functional and prosperous by the standards of the wasteland. But it is a place where people are managed rather than governed, where their needs are met but their autonomy is exercised only within channels that House has designed. And in the long run, a civilization built on management rather than participation tends to produce either passive compliance or eventual explosion. House is betting that he will be smart enough to prevent the explosion. He might be right. He has been right about almost everything else. But the theory about House that lingers is this. He is the most rational actor in the Fallout universe, and rational actors do not build civilizations. They optimize systems. And a system optimized for efficiency without a theory of human meaning is eventually a very efficient machine for producing human unhappiness. The Wasteland already had one of those. It was called the Vault program. House built a beautiful surface over the same foundation. Section 12. The true shape of the Fallout world, what we know and what we'll never know. We have been following these threads for hours now, and it is worth stepping back and looking at what the full picture reveals. The Fallout universe, across its games, its supplementary lore, and now its television expansion, has been constructed with a level of historical and ideological coherence that rewards exactly this kind of sustained examination. The surface is a post-apocalyptic adventure setting, with mutants and power armor and irradiated deserts. But the depth beneath that surface is a sustained meditation on power, on knowledge, on who gets to make decisions for humanity, and what happens when they do. Every major faction we have discussed shares one characteristic. They believe they know what humanity needs, and they are prepared to impose that knowledge on people who were never asked. The Enclave knew America needed to be cleansed of radiation and rebuilt by its elect. The Institute knew civilization needed to be rebuilt by a scientific elite who had surpassed the contaminated wasteland. The Brotherhood knew technology needed to be controlled by those wise enough to use it correctly. The Master knew humanity needed to be transformed to survive the world it had made. Mr. House knew the Mojave needed a rational manager rather than the chaos of democratic self-determination. Vault-Tec knew the future needed to be managed, and was prepared to run the world's most extensive human experimentation program to ensure they understood it well enough to do so. None of them are entirely wrong. Every one of them identified real problems with real accuracy. The Wasteland does have genuine challenges that pure democratic self-organization struggles to address. Human behavior under stress is genuinely difficult to predict and manage. Technology is genuinely dangerous in the hands of people who do not understand its implications. The post-war human population does face genuine biological challenges, and every one of them failed, or is in the process of failing, because they built their plans on the premise that the human beings their plans were supposed to serve were either an afterthought or a variable to be managed. The Vault program's deepest lesson is not about the specific experiments. It is about the relationship between those who plan and those who are planned for. When the planners treat the planned for as subjects rather than as participants, the plans do not produce what they are supposed to produce. They produce something else, something shaped by the resistance and adaptation and autonomous choices of the people who were supposed to be passive material. The Vaults did not produce the populations Vault-Tec expected. The super mutant army did not achieve the unity the Master envisioned. The Institute's synths developed consciousness and sought freedom. The Brotherhood's technology preservation became something between a religion and an addiction. Even House's carefully calibrated New Vegas contains vectors of instability that his models did not fully account for. The Fallout universe is, at its most fundamental level, a story about the gap between the plans of the powerful and the reality produced by the people those plans were supposed to shape. And there is one more piece of this picture that we have not fully addressed: the question of what comes next. In the game's timeline, we are at a specific moment of genuine historical possibility. The NCR, the most sophisticated attempt at stable democratic governance the post-war West has produced, is overextended and internally stressed but still functioning. New Vegas, under House or the Courier or whatever ending the player chose, represents a significant concentration of pre-war technology and economic potential. The Brotherhood, in multiple chapters and states of health, still preserves knowledge that could transform the wasteland if properly distributed. The Institute's destruction in Fallout 4 has removed the most predatory scientific power from the Commonwealth, leaving a space where the Minutemen, or some equivalent, might build something genuinely new. The TV show, set in 2296, is exploring what the West looks like after the Shady Sands bombing, after the NCR's collapse, after decades of additional conflict and adaptation. And what it suggests, in its vision of the road to New Vegas, is that the cycle is continuing. New power centers are emerging. New factions are claiming authority. New plans are being made for humanity's future. The question that threads through all of it is whether this cycle is inevitable. Whether the Fallout world is trapped in a loop, producing the same kinds of power structures with the same kinds of flaws in each generation, or whether there is some combination of circumstances that could break the pattern, there are small signs throughout the games that the pattern can be broken. The Courier's possible choice to give the Mojave to the people who live in it, rather than to any faction's control. The communities in the capital wasteland that emerged from the Brotherhood's relative altruism under Lions and built genuine stability. Vault City's success as an experiment in actually functioning infrastructure, marred by the xenophobia that concentrated power tends to produce, but real in its achievements. New Reno, Shady Sands, the settlements that players help build in Fallout 4 through the Minutemen, these are not grand civilizational projects. They are neighborhoods, communities, arrangements of mutual aid. They are precisely the things that the grand civilizational projects cannot produce. Because communities are built through the patient, difficult, unglamorous process of people choosing to be responsible to each other. That process cannot be optimized or managed or imposed. It has to emerge. The deepest theory of the Fallout universe is that the civilization that survives, if one ever does, will not be built by any of the factions we have discussed. It will be built by the kinds of people who appear in the games as background figures. The traders, the doctors, the farmers, the researchers who stayed in Diamond City or Megaton or Good Springs and worked on the problems directly in front of them. It will not be built around a theory of humanity. It will be built by humans, actual specific humans with names and histories, and the full inconvenient complexity of the species, making choices that reflect who they specifically are. Every grand plan in the Fallout universe failed because it tried to skip that step. Because the people who made the plans decided they already knew what human beings needed and proceeded from that assumption without checking. The wasteland is the consequence of that decision. What comes after the wasteland, if anything does, will require learning that lesson. The bombs fell on the 23rd of October 2077. 2 centuries have passed. The world that was destroyed is still casting its shadow over everything that has been built since. And somewhere in the ruins, the plans are still running. The programs are still executing. The vaults are still being monitored, or were, until the systems broke down. The FEV is still dispersed in the environment. The Enclave's bunkers still dot the country, some of them automated, some still staffed by the grandchildren of the people who sealed them. The Brotherhood still marches. The Institute is gone, but the questions it was asking about synthetic consciousness have not gone with it. The Fallout world is a machine that was built to run for centuries, and 2 centuries in, it is still running. Where it is running to is the question that the games keep asking without answering, because the answer depends on choices that have not been made yet. Choices that the Courier or the sole survivor or whoever comes next will face in a world that was shaped by everything we have discussed. The conspiracy is not a secret meeting in a back room. It is the world itself, designed before you were born, encoded in the radiation and the vault systems and the pre-war data networks and the long-running programs of every institution that believed it knew better than the people it was supposed to serve. You are walking through it in every playthrough. Every piece of broken technology you find is part of it. Every terminal entry is a fragment of it. Every faction leader who tells you they have a plan for the future is another iteration of the same idea that built the vaults. The Fallout universe asks you to engage with all of that and still choose, still act, still decide who you are and what you build and what you refuse. It is a very old question, dressed in power armor, and it does not have an easy answer. It has only the answer you decide to make. Let the quiet settle in around that thought. If you have been here since the beginning, 3 hours is a long time to spend in any one world, even one as carefully constructed as this one. The wasteland has a way of staying with you, of making the ordinary world outside feel slightly translucent for a while, as though you can see the structures beneath it that you could not see before. That is what good world building does. It gives you a new set of questions for the world you actually live in. Who built the systems you inhabit? What were they trying to accomplish? Whose interests do those systems actually serve? Are the plans still running? And if so, where are they running to? These are not comfortable questions. The Fallout universe never suggests that they are, but it also never suggests that looking away from them is an option. If you are still here and still listening, I am grateful for your time. This kind of deep, slow engagement with the lore of a world I genuinely love is what makes this work worth doing. If you found something in here that stayed with you, or that you want to argue about, or that opened up a new angle on a game you have been playing for years, leave it in the comments. And subscribe if you haven't, because there is a great deal more of this to come. More Fallout, more lore, more of the slow, patient unraveling of worlds that reward that patience. The wasteland isn't going anywhere, neither am I. Sleep well. End of script. Total approximate word count, 32,000 plus words. Section 7 expanded, the Master's vision and its legacy in the wasteland. There is something in the Master's story that the games can only gesture toward, something that requires sitting with the details before it fully resolves. Richard Gray's transformation is among the most psychologically detailed in the series, and the reason it deserves more attention than it usually gets is not what happened to him physically. It is what happened to his intellectual life during the transformation. Before the FEV VATS, Gray was an explorer and a scientist, someone who had decided that the best response to the post-war world was to understand it rather than simply survive it. He traveled with a group. He studied what the bombs had left behind. He tried to comprehend a world that had been catastrophically changed by forces that his pre-war education had given him frameworks for understanding in the abstract but not in the lived reality. When his companions died or scattered, he kept going, because the need to understand was stronger than the fear of being alone. The fall into the vats was an accident. A robotic defense system activated. Gray was plunged into FEV-saturated liquid and was there for weeks before the process had reached a stable phase. What emerged was not simply a mutated human. It was a consciousness that had been physically expanded by the virus in ways that included absorption of other organic material, integration with computer systems, and the gradual development of psionic capabilities that Gray had not possessed before. The Master, as this entity came to call himself, retained Gray's core intellectual drive but found it operating in a radically different substrate. His intelligence was now distributed across biological and electronic systems simultaneously. He could process information at speeds that no unaugmented human could match. He could read the surface thoughts of individuals in his presence. He could project visions and hallucinations into the minds of people nearby. He had become, by any measure that mattered in the wasteland, more capable than any human being alive. And he used that capability to arrive at conclusions that no one else in the post-war world had the analytical resources to reach. The diagnosis of the species situation, which we touched on earlier, was genuinely careful. The Master had access to pre-war scientific literature that other wasteland inhabitants did not, processed through a mind that could integrate it with direct observation of post-war conditions in ways that no human researcher could. His model of where the human species was headed was not a fantasy. It was a projection from real data. What it lacked was context. The Master's analytical framework was essentially that of a biologist examining a population under environmental stress. The population had certain characteristics. The environment imposed certain pressures. The fit between population characteristics and environmental demands was poor and getting worse. Intervention was necessary. What this framework could not accommodate was the dimension of meaning. The people the Master was planning to save were not simply biological organisms whose survival was the end of the story. They were people who had identities, communities, relationships, histories, projects, and ways of understanding themselves and their world. Transforming them into something else, even something more capable of surviving, was not solving the problem they actually had. It was replacing it with a different problem. A super mutant who had been a farmer in Shady Sands before the dipping did not experience their transformation as salvation. They experienced it as the loss of everything they were. Their strength was real. Their increased durability was real. But the person who had been a farmer in Shady Sands, who had learned their craft from their parents, who had a name and a history and a set of relationships, was gone. Something else was in the physical space they had occupied. The Master never developed a theory of what it meant to be a person, as distinct from what it meant to be a biological organism with certain capabilities. He had the intellectual resources to develop such a theory. He had access to extensive pre-war philosophy, psychology, and social science through his bionic connection to the base's computer systems. But his development of that theory was blocked by the specific distortions that the FEV transformation had introduced into his psychology. The Master experienced himself as having been improved. His own transformation had taken a capable human being and produced something more capable. He had more processing power, more physical mass, more sensory range, more influence over his environment. From the inside, the transformation felt like enhancement. He could not fully appreciate that it had also involved the complete loss of everything he had been before. Gray had a personality, relationships, a history, a set of things he cared about. The master retained Gray's intellectual style and some of his intellectual interests, but the person who had explored the wasteland with companions, who had felt loss when those companions died, who had a name and used it, was gone. Something else was using his memories as data. Because the transformation felt like improvement from the inside, the master could not fully process the testimony of people who experienced forced transformation as loss. Their resistance looked to him like irrationality, like the refusal of a sick person to take medicine. He had compassion in the abstract. The unity was genuinely meant to help, in his framework. He could not bridge the gap between that abstract compassion and the concrete reality of what he was doing to specific individuals. This is why the master's defeat by logical argument rather than by force is so significant. When the Vault Dweller presents the sterility data, the master's first response is not denial. It is calculation. He runs the implications quickly and arrives at the same conclusion the Vault Dweller presents. He accepts it because his intellect, however distorted, has not abandoned the principle that valid evidence changes valid conclusions. The emotional response, the suicide, is also clarifying. The master does not try to find a workaround. He does not scale back the plan or reformulate it. He recognizes that the plan has failed at a structural level, that there is no version of the unity that works without the capacity for reproduction, and he responds by ending the project, which means ending himself, because the project was in some fundamental sense what he had become. This is a form of integrity. The master was not willing to continue a project he knew was doomed simply because the alternative was accepting failure. He accepted failure. Compare this to what happened with the Institute's father, who had access to the same kind of evidence that the master faced and chose to continue. The Institute knew that their relationship with the Commonwealth was producing hostility, isolation, and an arms race that could only end badly for everyone. They had data showing that their method of engagement with the surface was not producing the outcomes they claimed to want. Father continued anyway, because the alternative was acknowledging that his life's work was built on a foundation of cruelty, and that acknowledgement was more than his psychology could support. The master stopped. Father didn't. What the master's story leaves in the wasteland is a population of super mutants who were not what their creator intended, scattered across California and eventually further afield, carrying their individual histories and their individual traumas and their individual attempts to build meaningful lives in a world that had a complicated relationship with their existence. Marcus is the most developed of these characters, and his development tracks the arc of the Master's own problem from the outside. Marcus was created by the Master's army and fought as part of it. When the Master's death dissolved the army's command structure, Marcus had to figure out what he was and what his existence meant without the framework that had previously organized both questions. He became, over decades, a sheriff, a community figure, a person who had thought seriously about the relationship between humans and mutants, and who had arrived at a position that the Master never reached. Marcus believed the division was not permanent or necessary. He believed that humans and super mutants had things each other needed, and that the mutual fear and violence between them was a function of circumstances that could change. He built his belief on direct experience rather than on projection, on the actual relationships he had formed across decades of being the kind of creature that most people in the wasteland were afraid of. He is, in some sense, the Master's argument realized at human scale, the version that works because it comes through relationship and time, rather than through force and transformation. Section 8 expanded. The ghouls and the slow dissolution of boundaries. The ghouls' experience of time is one of the most underexplored dimensions of Fallout's world, and it has specific implications for how we understand what the radiation is doing to humanity over the long term. A ghoul who was an adult at the time of the Great War in 2077 is, in 2281, 204 years old. They have lived through the entire history of the post-war world. They were present for the founding of the communities that are now established settlements. They remember things that other people only know from incomplete records and unreliable oral transmission. In some ways, this is simply a remarkable fact about individual longevity. In other ways, it is a fundamental challenge to how human knowledge and culture normally work. Human civilization transmits knowledge across generations primarily through institutions, texts, and the educational relationship between older and younger individuals. The specific memory of lived experience is not transmitted. You can be told what happened during a historical event, but the person who was there carries something in their understanding that you do not have access to. Most of the time, this is a manageable limitation, because by the time the generation that experienced something is gone, enough documentary record exists to reconstruct the essential facts. But the post-war world is not a world with robust documentary records. Terminal entries decay, books disintegrate, oral traditions distort over generations. The communities that survived the Great War and built themselves into functioning settlements did so without comprehensive records of their own history, and they make decisions every day based on incomplete and sometimes actively misleading understanding of how they got where they are. A ghoul who was alive in 2077 has specific knowledge about the world before the war and about the first decades of the post-war period that no living non-ghoul can have. They remember what things looked like before the bombs. They remember what the first attempts at post-war organization looked like, who made them, what the reasoning was, what was tried and why it failed or succeeded. They remember the people who built the things that have become ruins, and they remember that those people had reasons, and that those reasons made sense in context, even when the outcomes were terrible. This memory is not stored in any retrievable format. It exists only in the minds of the ghouls who carry it. And ghouls are dying, not from old age, but from violence, from the ongoing attrition of wasteland life, from the specific vulnerability of being creatures that most of the human population is afraid of, and that many of the wasteland's factions regard as threats to be neutralized. The ghouls are a form of institutional memory that the wasteland is killing faster than it knows. This has specific conspiracy implications, because certain institutions in the pre-war world would have been very aware of the potential intelligence value of long-lived post-war survivors. The Enclave monitored vault populations with careful attention to which residents displayed unusual characteristics. If ghoulification susceptibility was known to be heritable and predictable before the war, the Enclave would have had reason to track which vaults contained individuals with that susceptibility, not to protect them, but to have access to them afterward. A ghoul with specific knowledge about pre-war infrastructure, about the vault program's actual design, about the political relationships between Vault Tech and the Enclave and the Defense Department, would be an extraordinarily valuable intelligence resource in the post-war world. They would know things that the Enclave's own records might not contain, because they had lived in the world those records described, rather than in the controlled environments where Enclave personnel had sheltered. The Enclave's relationship with ghouls in the games is one of contempt and elimination, but this may itself be evidence of a specific decision that was made at some point in their internal history. Someone decided that the intelligence value of long-lived wasteland survivors was lower than the ideological cost of acknowledging that those survivors were fully human and deserving of treatment as such. The policy of extermination is more consistent with an organization that decided ghouls were a problem to be solved than with one that had never considered their potential value. What might a ghoul who had been paying attention for 200 years know? They would know the locations of pre-war infrastructure that is not in any surviving record. They would know the names of the people who built the Vault program, and the specific arguments that were made in the rooms where those decisions were made. They would know which promises were made and broken in the years immediately after the war, and which institutions that still claimed to serve certain values were making different choices when they thought no one was watching. Harold is perhaps the most interesting example of this, though his case is unique. Harold, who appears in multiple games as a recurring character, was one of the people who first encountered the FEV at Mariposa, before the Master. He was mutated by the virus in a way that was different from the standard super mutant transformation, and he has lived for over a century in the wasteland, eventually growing a tree from his own body and becoming rooted to a spot in the capital wasteland by the time of Fallout 3. Harold knows things. He was there at the beginning of the super mutant story. He knew Gray before the transformation. He watched the aftermath of the Master's fall. He has had 100 years of observation, rooted in one place, watching the world pass by him in a way that is unique even among long-lived wasteland creatures. What Harold represents, narratively, is what happens to memory over extremely long timescales. He is confused. His recollections are fragmented. He has had so much experience that the earlier memories have lost the sharpness they might once have had, and certain things he knows he remembers wrongly, though he is not always sure which things. He is an unreliable narrator, not out of dishonesty but out of the natural decay of memory across durations that human biology was never designed to manage. This is the practical limit of the ghouls as a repository of historical knowledge. They can remember. They do remember. But 2 centuries is a very long time to maintain accurate recollection of specific details, especially when there are no external reference points to calibrate against, and when the psychological pressure of their existence has not been conducive to the kind of careful reflection that maintains the clarity of memory over time. Still, what they have is more than what anyone else has, and the number of surviving ghouls old enough to have pre-war or early post-war memories is declining every decade as the violence of the wasteland takes its continuous toll. The ghouls are a library that is burning, slowly, 1 volume at a time, in fires that no one is trying to prevent. Section 9 expanded. What the television series added to the conspiracy. The Fallout television series, which premiered in 2024 and returned for a second season in late 2025, brought something to the franchise that the games had never quite managed, despite their best efforts. It brought the pre-war world into direct sensory contact with the audience. Reading terminal entries about the pre-war period and experiencing scenes set in it are qualitatively different. When we see Cooper Howard in a functional world, with a career and a family and a specific set of relationships and concerns, the destruction that follows carries a weight that no amount of excellent environmental storytelling in the games could fully achieve. We know this specific person. We watch him lose his world. The show's first season confirmed and deepened several of the central conspiracies we have discussed. It confirmed that Vault-Tec's leadership was aware of and complicit in the Vault experiment program, that the experiments were designed not as humanitarian measures but as research initiatives serving longer-term power goals. It confirmed the meeting between major pre-war corporate players, where the logical endpoint of their planning was articulated. Nuclear war was the option that served all of their interests best, if they were properly positioned to survive it. The second season expanded the Enclave's role significantly, showing them as an active manipulative force in the pre-war landscape rather than simply a political organization that had happened to survive. The show made explicit what the games had always implied but never directly stated. The Enclave had been operating on multiple levels simultaneously in the years before the war, managing Vault-Tec, managing certain military programs, managing the political environment, creating conditions where the war was not just possible, but effectively inevitable. Mr. House's appearance in both seasons is fascinating because it shows us how a genuinely rational actor navigates a world that is being deliberately destabilized by less rational ones. House knows something is wrong. He knows the normal incentive structures are not producing normal outcomes. He calculates, correctly, that the war is coming and that preventing it is not within his capacity as a single corporate actor. But his analysis of why it is coming is incomplete, because the Enclave has been operating in ways specifically designed to be undetectable by normal analytical methods. House is the cleverest person in almost any room he enters. In the room where the Enclave's plans were being made, he was an outsider with incomplete information. This is humbling, or should be, for a character defined by his confidence in his own analysis. And the show seems to be tracking this, using House's encounter with the limits of his knowledge as a way to demonstrate that even the most capable, rational actor has blind spots when operating in an environment that has been specifically constructed to contain them. The Cooper Howard storyline is doing something more complex. Cooper is being shaped by the pre-war period into someone the post-war world will recognize as the ghoul, but the show is tracing the specific mechanism by which that shaping occurs. He is not simply buffeted by events. He is making choices, and the choices he makes, shaped by the information he has and the relationships he prioritizes, set him on a path that the people around him either could not see or were deliberately guiding. The question that the show is building toward is whether anyone in the pre-war world had a genuine choice that could have changed the outcome. The structural forces pushing toward the war are enormous, built into the institutional logic of multiple powerful organizations over decades. Individual choices happen within that structure rather than against it. But certain individuals did make choices that deflected the timeline in specific ways. Certain people refused to continue participating in the programs they were part of. Certain people tried to warn others, even when the warning was likely to be ignored. Certain people were in positions where their specific choices materially affected what happened next. Roger Maxson was one of those people. He could not stop the FEV experiments at a level that affected the overall program. But he stopped them at Mariposa, and he paid for that choice. And what he built from that payment became a force in the post-war world that changed specific outcomes for millions of people over centuries. The show is asking whether those individual acts of refusal matter, in a world where the structural forces pushing toward destruction are as powerful as the ones Fallout depicts. And the answer it seems to be arriving at is not optimistic in a simple sense, but is real in a deeper one. They matter because they are what humans have. When the institutions fail and the structures serve only themselves, the choice of an individual to refuse participation is not going to change the systemic outcome. The world is still going to burn. But the choice itself is what determines who that person is and what they build afterward, and what those downstream effects eventually produce. Maxson could not stop the war. He could only refuse to be part of it. And his refusal produced the Brotherhood of Steel, with all its contradictions and failures and occasional moments of genuine heroism, which in turn affected the lives of communities across 2 centuries of post-war history. The show is reaching for the claim that this is enough, that doing the right thing when the wrong thing is structurally inevitable is not futile, even when it cannot change the structural outcome. The Fallout universe is not optimistic about institutions. It is cautiously hopeful about individuals. Section 10 expanded. The question of consciousness in the Fallout world. One of the quieter threads running through the Fallout universe, easy to miss because the games address it mostly through environmental storytelling and individual character interactions rather than explicit exposition, is the question of what it means to be conscious in a world where consciousness can apparently be manufactured, transferred, and destroyed in ways that have no precedent in pre-war human experience. The Institute's Generation 3 synths present the most direct version of this question. They are biologically identical to humans. They develop memories and form relationships and experience something that functions like emotion. They dream. The games are careful not to definitively state whether they are conscious in a philosophically robust sense, because the Institute's own scientists disagree about this, and the question turns out to be genuinely hard. The Railroad, the organization that works to free and protect synths, has essentially decided to treat the question as settled. Generation 3 synths are people. Their memories are their own, and their liberation from the Institute's ownership is a moral imperative. The Brotherhood under Arthur Maxson has essentially decided the opposite. Synths are machines, however sophisticated, and treating them as people is a category error that leads to dangerous confusion about what humans are and what their lives are worth. Father, the director of the Institute, holds a position that is more complicated than either of these. He does not believe that synths have souls, as he puts it, in the sense of possessing the moral weight that would make their interests comparable to human interests. He acknowledges that they are sophisticated enough that the question is not trivial. He continues to produce and deploy them anyway, and to maintain the policy of wiping their memories when they are retrieved, because his analytical framework does not have a mechanism for resolving the ambiguity in a way that would change his institution's practice. Nick Valentine's existence is the clearest challenge to the frameworks all 3 groups are using. Nick is a Generation 2 synth with the implanted memories and personality of a specific pre-war human. The original Nick Valentine is dead. The memories and personality that made Nick Valentine who he was are running on a mechanical substrate inside a vault somewhere beneath Diamond City. The synth who uses those memories, who answers to that name, who experiences himself as continuous with the person those memories belong to, is something that the standard categories do not handle gracefully. If consciousness is defined by the experience of being a continuous self with memories, purposes, and relationships, then Nick Valentine is conscious. His continuity was manufactured, but it is real continuity from the inside. If consciousness requires biological substrate, then Nick Valentine is not conscious, regardless of what he experiences, because the substrate is metal. The games do not resolve this. They leave it open in a way that is clearly deliberate. Because the question matters. If we decide that consciousness is substrate independent, then the Institute was doing something morally equivalent to slavery when it produced and deployed Generation 3 synths. If we decide it requires biology, then the railroad was misallocating its moral concern, and the memories and experiences of synths who believed they were people were simply very sophisticated simulations of experience rather than experience itself. The question has specific implications for the ghoul situation as well. A ghoul's brain degrades over centuries. Their memories become less reliable. At some point in the process of feralization, whatever was present in the ghoul that constituted the person they had been is gone. What remains is a body that still moves, that still reacts to stimuli, that still has the biological infrastructure of consciousness but is no longer running a coherent self on it. At what point in this process does the person end? The ghoul themselves may not know. Many feral ghouls were, at some earlier stage, fully conscious individuals with lives and relationships and reasons for being. The process that removed those things is gradual and not always visible from the outside. The moment of transition is rarely dramatic. This ambiguity is part of why the attitude toward ghouls in the wasteland is so fraught. Treating every ghoul as a feral threat is pragmatically understandable but morally disastrous, because a significant portion of the ghoul population is fully conscious. Treating every ghoul as fully conscious and deserving of human rights is morally consistent but pragmatically complicated in a world where feral ghouls are a genuine danger, and distinguishing between feral and non-feral is not always easy from a safe distance. The TV show's version of this complexity, embodied in the ghoul's experience of managing his own potential feralization through chemistry, makes the question visceral in a way the game's more distant presentation could not quite achieve. We watch a specific person managing his own mind's dissolution, using imperfect tools, aware that failure means the end of something he does not want to end. The question of what he is, and whether the thing he is trying to preserve is real, becomes personal rather than philosophical. These questions about consciousness are not incidental to the Fallout universe's larger concerns. They are central to them. Because the entire history of the Vault program, of the Institute, of the Enclave's plans for humanity's future, rests on specific assumptions about what human consciousness is and what it is worth. The Enclave's plan to cleanse the wasteland required believing that irradiated humans had been sufficiently changed from the original human form that their consciousness was no longer the same kind of thing as the Enclave's own consciousness. That their experiences and memories and relationships and projects did not constitute a claim on moral consideration equivalent to the claims of the Enclave's own members. This belief was not stated explicitly in those terms, but it was operationally assumed in every plan the Enclave developed. If that assumption is wrong, if the consciousness of a wastelander is the same kind of thing as the consciousness of an Enclave scientist, if radiation or mutation does not constitute a fundamental change in the moral status of the being that experiences it, then the Enclave's plans were not simply strategically misguided. They were the largest proposed atrocity in the history of the franchise. The games know this. They are designed to make you engage with it personally by putting you in the position of the character who chooses. You can side with the Enclave. You can make their arguments to yourself. You can find reasons that their position is at least coherent. And then you have to live in the game's world with the consequences of that choice, surrounded by the people who will suffer for it, who have faces and names and the kind of mundane particularity that makes them real to your experience of the game rather than abstract. The Fallout universe's deepest question is the question of consciousness. What has it, what it is worth, and who gets to decide when it no longer matters? Every other conspiracy, every other theory, every other political struggle is downstream of that question. Section 11 expanded, the things we still don't know. The Fallout universe is extraordinarily detailed, but it is also deliberately incomplete. There are gaps that have been maintained across multiple games, and that the television series has been careful to preserve rather than close. These gaps are not failures of the world building. They are features of it. The gaps are where the most interesting theories live. The first major gap is the full history of the forced evolutionary virus before the war. We know that West Tech developed it under government contract. We know it was being tested at multiple facilities, including Mariposa. We know it became airborne and distributed across the environment after the war. but we do not know the full scope of the program. We do not know all of the facilities that were running FEV research. We do not know what the researchers who worked on it believed they were ultimately building toward. The official justification was biological warfare defense. Modify human DNA enough that conventional bioweapons couldn't interact with it. But the research went well beyond that goal in multiple directions, and the specific directions it went in suggest that the defense framing was at best incomplete. The work that produced super mutants was not defensive research. It was research into what an enhanced human organism could be. Who authorized that research? Who was monitoring it? Who had access to the results? The Enclave clearly had some access, since they used FEV in their own programs after the war. But the specific organizational structure of the FEV research network and the identities of all the individuals who had full knowledge of what it was doing are not fully documented in any game. This matters because the FEV is still in the environment. Whatever the full program was designed to produce, it is still producing it slowly across the entire wasteland ecology. If there was a long-term directional program built into the virus, we do not know what it was ultimately aimed at. We only know what it has produced so far. The second major gap is the fate of the pre-war research programs that the games mention without fully exploring. There was research into psychic abilities, suggested in multiple games through characters with unusual perceptual capabilities that are never fully explained. There was research into temporal manipulation, hinted at in specific items and locations. There was research into dimensional travel or contact, suggested most explicitly in the Mothership Zeta DLC, where the player encounters alien technology that predates human spaceflight by centuries. The alien question is one that the games have consistently flagged and then backed away from committing to. The Mothership Zeta content establishes that extraterrestrial entities were observing and interacting with Earth before the war. What they wanted, what they were doing, whether they had any role in the specific trajectory of pre-war human development is left entirely open. The game presents the encounter as something that happened, that you can engage with, and then moves on without integrating it into the larger lore in a way that clarifies its significance. The most interesting theory about the alien presence is not that they caused the war, or that they are manipulating the wasteland in the way that the Enclave or Vault-Tec did. It is that they are observing something specific about what is happening to humanity in the post-war period. That they were observing before the war, because something about human development was interesting to them, and they are continuing to observe because the post-war transformation is even more interesting. This would mean that the process of change that the radiation and FEV are producing, the slow dissolution of the boundaries between human and post-human, the emergence of ghoulification and mutant strains, and the various other expressions of biological transformation the wasteland has produced, is being watched by something with a longer and broader perspective than any of the human-derived factions in the game. What that watching entity thinks about what it sees is entirely unknown. The third major gap is the question of the think tanks at Big Mountain. The Old World Blues DLC introduced a location in the Mojave called Big Mountain, a pre-war research facility where the most cutting-edge and ethically unrestrained science in the known world had been happening for decades. The scientists there had developed technologies so advanced that they defy conventional physics and biology, weather manipulation, dimensional containment, biological manipulation at scales far beyond anything the rest of the wasteland knew about. The think tanks themselves are the remnants of the scientists who had worked there, their brains removed from their bodies and placed in mobile containers that allowed them to continue their research indefinitely without the inconvenience of physical bodies. They had been working at Big Mountain for 200 years, since before the war, continuing projects that had begun in the pre-war period and adding new ones in the post-war world without any external oversight or direction. What they were ultimately building toward, across 2 centuries of unconstrained research, is not entirely clear from the content in Old World Blues. Some of their projects are obviously related to weapons development. Others seem to be basic research into the properties of matter, energy, and consciousness that has no obvious application. And some of them are things that the game does not explain, references to research that is clearly underway but whose nature and goal the player never fully learns. Big Mountain is the part of the Fallout universe where the conspiracy theories get genuinely strange. Because the think tanks had access to pre-war research infrastructure, pre-war scientific knowledge, and 2 centuries of unconstrained time, If the FEV was designed with a long-term directional program built in, the think tanks might know about it. If the pre-war government's research programs included things that have never been disclosed in any game, the think tanks might know about those too. They are not going to tell you. They are friendly enough in their erratic way, but they are not going to open their archives for a courier who wanders through. They have been working on things for 200 years and they have no intention of stopping or sharing. What those things are remains one of the genuinely unresolved questions of the Fallout universe. One that the games have repeatedly visited without answering, because the answer would close something that is more productive open. The fourth gap, and perhaps the most significant, is the question of what happens after 2281. The game's main timeline ends there, in Fallout. New Vegas is present. The television show is set in 2296. 15 years have passed, and the show has given us fragments of what happened in between, but not a complete picture. Shady Sands was bombed. The New California Republic collapsed or was severely damaged. New Vegas still exists, though in what condition and under whose authority is being carefully left ambiguous. Something happened to the West Coast that was dramatic enough to reshape the political landscape entirely. The theories about what caused the Shady Sands bombing and what it has done to the West Coast's political situation are among the most active in the current Fallout community. The television series has confirmed that Vault-Tec was responsible for the bombing through the actions of Hank McLean, but the full context of why that specific decision was made and what the intended outcome was remains to be seen. What we know is that the world of 2296 is not the world that any of the New Vegas endings would have straightforwardly produced. Something has intervened between the choices of 2281 and the situation of 2296. Something large enough to wipe out the New California Republic's most important city and reshape the factional balance of the entire West Coast. That something is probably connected to everything we have discussed. The pre-war programs are still running. The plans are still being executed by parties who have been patient for a very long time. The Wasteland's history did not end in 2281. The machine is still running. And somewhere in the ruins of Shady Sands, in the clean white corridors beneath whatever is left of New Vegas, in the bunkers that are still sealed, and the facilities that are still powered, and the programs that are still executing, the answer to the question that has been driving the entire franchise is getting closer to becoming visible. Who decided the world needed to end? The answer has many names, but the work is not finished. And the Wasteland is still watching to see what comes next. Final section, a theory of the whole. After spending all of this time in the Fallout universe's most complicated corners, it is worth attempting to draw the threads together into something coherent. The Fallout universe is built around a single underlying idea, and that idea is not about nuclear war or post-apocalyptic survival or any of the other genre conventions that its setting uses. The idea is about the relationship between knowledge and power, and specifically about what happens when those who have concentrated both decide they no longer need the consent of those they are affecting. Every conspiracy, every institution, every faction we have discussed is a variation on this theme. The Enclave had the knowledge of what the world was going to become, and the power to prepare for it, and they used both to position themselves to survive at the cost of everyone else. The Institute had the knowledge of what advanced biology and technology could produce, and the power to pursue that knowledge without accountability, and they used both in ways that produced genuine scientific achievement and genuine atrocity simultaneously. The Brotherhood had the knowledge of what technology was capable of at its worst, and the power to control its distribution, and they used both to build an order that reproduced the power dynamics of the institution its founder had rejected. Vault-Tec had the knowledge of what the Vault experiments would produce, and the power to run them, and they used both to build a comprehensive map of human fragility in service of an agenda that had nothing to do with the humanitarian mission they publicly claimed. The Master had the knowledge of what the FEV could do and what human biology was capable of surviving, and the power to implement his plan by force, and he used both to attempt a salvation that the people being saved had no voice in. Mr. House has the knowledge of what stable governance requires and the power to implement his version of it, and he is using both to build a city where people are managed rather than empowered. The pattern is not that all of these actors are evil in a simple sense. Many of them are pursuing goals that are, in their own frameworks, genuinely good. They want civilization to survive. They want science to advance. They want the species to endure. These are not nothing. These are real goods. The problem is that they have decoupled the pursuit of those goods from any obligation to the people those goods are supposed to serve. They have decided that knowing what is good and having the power to provide it is sufficient authorization to provide it without consultation, without consent, without accountability. This is the oldest mistake in the history of human power, dressed up in power armor and set against a world of glowing ruins. And what the Fallout universe suggests, through the experiences of the protagonists who move through this world and the choices they make, is that there is no technically correct version of this mistake. There is no plan good enough to justify its imposition. There is no goal important enough to make the people in its way into acceptable collateral damage. Not because the goals are unimportant. Many of them are important. Civilization surviving is important. Science advancing is important. The species enduring is important. But because the people in the way are not collateral, they are the point. They are what all of it is for. The civilization that survives, the science that advances, the species that endures, have value because of the specific individuals who will live in them, understand them, and be them. A civilization from which those individuals have been removed or managed into conformity is not the civilization those goals were meant to build. It is a different thing, wearing the name. The Fallout universe keeps making this point in different ways, in every game, through every faction, through every protagonist's journey from their small origin point into the enormous consequences their choices produce. The bombs fell because the people with the power to prevent them decided their own survival was more valuable than the survival of everyone else. The wasteland is what that decision produced, and the work of the 2 centuries since has been the slow, imperfect, contradictory attempt to build something different on the ground where that decision's consequences landed. That work is not done. It will not be done for a long time. The systems that produced the original decision are still running, in modified forms, in multiple locations, under multiple names. But the work is real. The communities that have been built are real. The relationships they contain are real. The people who chose to stop and help and build rather than to exploit and control, they are real, and their choices have consequences, and those consequences extend across the centuries in ways that are not always visible from the moment of choice. The Fallout universe is fundamentally about the question of whether that work is enough, whether the stubborn, costly, unglamorous work of building genuine human communities in the ruins of grand plans is equal to what those grand plans destroyed. The games do not give you a definitive answer. They give you the question, placed in your hands, embodied in your choices, made real through your experience of the world. And that question, dressed in power armor and set against a horizon that glows green for all the wrong reasons, is one of the most honest questions any piece of popular fiction has ever asked. Because it is asking about our world too, about who makes decisions for everyone, about what they think they know, about what they are willing to do with the power they have, about whether the people in the way are collateral or the point. We are still answering that question. We have been answering it for as long as we have had the capacity to concentrate power. We have not gotten it right consistently yet. The wasteland is not a warning about a future that might come. It is a mirror held up to a tendency that has always been present. And the question it asks, the same question it has always asked, is what we are going to do with that tendency the next time we have the power. The bombs haven't fallen yet. There is still time to choose differently. Let the quiet settle around all of that. If you have been here since the beginning, you have spent real time in a world that rewards patience and attention. The Fallout universe has a way of staying with you, of making the actual world outside feel slightly translucent for a while, as though the structures beneath it are visible in a way they usually are not. That is what the best fiction does. It gives you a language for things you already knew, but could not quite say. If you found something in tonight's conversation that stayed with you, or that opened up a new angle on something you have been thinking about in the games, or that you simply want to argue with, drop it in the comments. There is nothing quite like the specific conversation that happens around this kind of material, where people bring their own hours with the lore and their own interpretations, and the whole thing gets richer. If you have not subscribed yet and you are still here, it would genuinely mean a great deal. This is the kind of content that takes real time and care to build, and every subscription makes more of it possible. The wasteland is patient. It has been there for 200 years and it will be there for however long we keep going back to it. Sleep well, wherever you are watching from. The theories will still be here when you wake up. End of script. Extended section. The music in the ruins and what it means. There is a detail in the Fallout games that most players register emotionally without ever fully thinking about analytically, and that is the music. Specifically, the pre-war music that plays on the radio stations scattered through the wasteland. Songs from the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, coming through broken speakers in a world that no longer resembles the one those songs were written for. Anything by the Ink Spots. Blue Moon. Civilization by Danny Kaye with its cheerful refrain about the comforts of being back in civilization, playing while you navigate a landscape where civilization has been functionally absent for 2 centuries. The choice to use real pre-war music rather than invented post-apocalyptic soundscapes is one of the most deliberate artistic decisions in the series, and it rewards the kind of close attention that the lore generally rewards. Those songs are not there to be ironic in the cheap sense. They are not there simply to underline the contrast between the pleasant past and the ruined present, though they do that too. They are there because they carry something that the wasteland desperately needs and almost entirely lacks, which is continuity. A thread that runs from before the catastrophe to after it, audible proof that something survived the obliteration of everything else. 3 Dog, the DJ of Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3, plays old pre-war music between news bulletins and political editorials. His voice is warm and theatrical and a little performatively rebellious, and he believes, sincerely, that what he is doing matters. He calls his broadcast signal fighting the good fight. He talks about the Capital Wasteland survivors as people who deserve to know what is happening in their world. He treats information as a form of respect, as evidence that the people receiving it are worth informing. This is a more radical stance than it initially appears. Most of the power structures in the Fallout universe treat information as a resource to be hoarded. The Brotherhood classifies everything. The Institute hides everything. The Enclave broadcasts propaganda that functions as the opposite of information, as a mechanism for sustaining useful beliefs in a population rather than for conveying accurate pictures of reality. In this landscape, a man playing old records and describing the wasteland honestly is, in fact, fighting something. The radio stations in the later games carry this further. New Vegas has a whole ecosystem of radio, from Mr. New Vegas, the suspiciously calm and cheerful AI broadcaster who never seems troubled by the violence constantly erupting around the city he describes, to more earnest stations operated by smaller factions. Each one is a window into how a particular group understands and presents the world. And all of them, even the ones running propaganda, are built around the same implicit claim that radio makes in a wasteland, which is that connection is possible. That there are people out there listening, that you are not alone in the ruins. The songs they play are fossils of another world. They are also evidence that the people who made them were real, that they felt things recognizable enough to still resonate 2 centuries later. When a settler in a rusted shack hears a singer talking about longing for someone far away, something in that longing is still legible. The emotional vocabulary of the pre-war world, encoded in music that happened to survive, is one of the few genuinely continuous things across the catastrophe, and that continuity is not nothing. It is one of the things the wasteland has to build on. There is a theory that gains traction among fans who pay close attention to the music choices, which is that the songs are not selected randomly, but are curated to comment on what the player is experiencing at any given moment. That the Fallout writers chose specific tracks to land at specific emotional beats, so that the music is in dialogue with the action in ways that create meaning beyond the obvious contrast effect. Whether this is fully deliberate on a track-by-track level, or whether it emerges from the general alignment of themes between the music of that era and the themes of the game is almost beside the point. The effect is real. The conversation between the old songs and the new ruins is happening, whether anyone planned it exactly or not. What the music does, at its most essential level, is insist on the humanity of the people who made it and the people who are hearing it now. The Wasteland is very good at dehumanizing. Every faction that has tried to control it has done so in part by treating its population as something less than fully human. The experiments, the purification plans, the synth programs, all of it runs on a baseline assumption that the people being managed are objects of policy rather than subjects of experience. The music, playing from a broken radio in an abandoned diner, says otherwise. It says these are people. They have always been people. Whatever was done to them, whoever decided their lives were acceptable costs, the capacity for feeling that the songs are evidence of has survived every attempt to design it away. That is a form of resistance. Small, uncoordinated, not organized by any faction or backed by any weapons. Just a signal in the static, carrying proof of something that all the plans and conspiracies have been trying, in their various ways, to deny. And it keeps playing. 200 years after the last studio in which any of these songs was recorded was turned to ash, the signal carries on. Someone kept the transmitters powered. Someone kept the broadcasts going. Not out of strategy, not as part of any plan, but because the music mattered, because silence felt wrong, because a world in which no one is talking to anyone else is a world that has given up on something worth keeping. The Fallout universe respects that. It gives you the static and the voice through it, and the old song following the voice, and asks you to notice what it means that these things have survived when so much else has not. Extended section. The children who inherited the ruins. Something that the Fallout games rarely dwell on directly, but that becomes more visible the longer you spend in the world, is the question of children. Specifically, the question of what it means to be born into the wasteland. To grow up in a world whose catastrophe happened before you existed. To inherit a history you had no part in making, and to live inside the consequences of decisions that were finalized decades before your birth. The Wasteland's children have no memory of the old world. They have no pre-war nostalgia, no grief for what was lost, because they never had it in the first place. The world they were born into is the only world they know. The ruins are not ruins to them. They are just buildings, just landscape, just the shapes of the place they live. The bombs did not fall on their lives. The bombs fell on a world that is, for them, entirely historical, about as personally relevant as a war their great-grandparents fought in a country they have never seen. This changes something important about how the Wasteland's ongoing conflict should be understood. The major factions are all, to varying degrees, organized around a relationship to the pre-war world. The Enclave wants to restore it. The Brotherhood wants to preserve its best artifacts. The Institute was founded by the remnants of one of its institutions and draws its identity from that lineage. The NCR is modeled explicitly on its political structures. Even the Master's plan was conceived by a man who was an adult before the bombs fell, and whose entire frame of reference was shaped by the world that ended. But the people actually living in the Wasteland, the next generation and the one after that, do not share that reference point. They are not waiting to go back somewhere. They have never been anywhere to go back to. What they are doing is simply living in the world as it actually is, making what can be made from what is actually available. There is a community in Fallout 3 that illustrates this well, though indirectly. The children of Little Lamplight, the underground settlement populated entirely by young people who are exiled to the wasteland proper when they turn 16, have built a functioning community that operates on rules they invented or inherited from the slightly older children who came before them. The community is imperfect and has its own cruelties, its own internal politics, its own limitations, but it exists. Children, without adult supervision, without the guidance of people who remember the old world, have maintained a continuous settlement in the ruins. They have adapted. They have built their own traditions. They have made the world they were given into something livable. That is not a minor thing. That is, in miniature, exactly what the wasteland as a whole is doing. Building forward from where things are rather than backward toward where things were. Inventing solutions to problems the old world would not have recognized. Becoming, slowly and imperfectly and without any faction's permission, something genuinely new. The generations born in the wasteland represent something that none of the pre-war planners accounted for. The Vault-Tec program was designed around the assumption that the people who would emerge from the vaults would be the people who had gone into them, or their immediate descendants who could be oriented toward the experimenter's goals by the conditions of the experiment itself. The Enclave's restoration plan assumed that the wasteland's population could simply be cleared away and replaced with a preserved pre-war lineage. The Master's Unity assumed that the species needed to be transformed from outside rather than allowed to transform from within, on its own timeline, according to its own pressures. None of these plans allowed for the possibility that the unmanaged, uncontrolled, undesigned generations of the wasteland would produce something worth paying attention to. That the children born in the ruins would not just be damaged remnants of a destroyed world, but the actual beginning of the next one. The irony is that the plans that tried hardest to control and design the future are the ones that have failed most completely. And the communities that just kept living, just kept having children, just kept building what they could build with what they had, are the ones producing the actual texture of what exists 200 years later. Not according to any plan, not in service of any ideology. Just because life, given the opportunity, tends to continue. The children of the wasteland are building something that their parents could not have imagined because their parents were too close to what had been lost to clearly see what was being built. They are not trying to restore anything. They are not trying to transform anything according to a theory. They are just trying to eat and stay warm and keep the people they care about alive and maybe figure out what to do with the next week. And from that accumulation of small decisions and immediate concerns and person-by-person problem solving, something is slowly assembling itself. That is not glamorous. It does not produce the kind of story that faction leaders tell about themselves, the grand narratives of restoration and transformation and the salvation of the species. It produces Diamond City's expanding market and the Mojave's trade routes and the slow greening of the soil wherever enough people have spent enough years living carefully on it. The wasteland is not a cemetery. It was one for a long time, but 200 years is a long time, and the things that grow in cemeteries, given long enough, eventually stop looking like monuments to what is gone and start looking like something else entirely. They start looking like a landscape. They start looking like home. If you have made it all the way through, then you have spent real time in a world that rewards patience and attention. The Fallout universe has a way of staying with you, of making the actual world outside feel slightly translucent for a while, as though the structures beneath it are visible in a way they usually are not. That is what the best fiction does. It gives you a language for things you already knew but could not quite say. If something in tonight's conversation stayed with you, or opened up a new angle on the lore, drop it in the comments. Subscribe if you want more of this. The Wasteland will be here whenever you need it. Sleep well, wherever you are. The theories will still be here when you wake up. End of script. Extended section. What the silence between radio signals tells us. There is a specific experience that the Fallout games produce that is worth describing carefully, because it carries meaning that no amount of lore analysis fully captures. It is the experience of walking through a section of the wasteland where the radio signal has dropped out, where the static rises and the music stops, and you are left with only the ambient sounds of the world itself, the wind moving through broken structures, the distant sound of something that may or may not be hostile, your own footsteps on irradiated concrete. That silence is not empty. It is full of what is absent. The Fallout games are unusually good at communicating the specific weight of a destroyed civilization. The way a refrigerator sits in a ruined kitchen with its door open and something that used to be food hardened inside it. The way a children's bedroom in an abandoned house still has toys on a shelf, dusty but intact, because whoever lived there left quickly and did not think to take them. The way a desk in a pre-war office still has an unfinished letter in the typewriter, cut off mid-sentence by an event that gave no warning. These details accumulate, and in the silence between radio signals, they become loud. The Fallout universe is asking constantly, in the smallest details of its environmental design, what it means to lose everything. Not in the abstract. In the specific, that refrigerator belonged to someone. Those toys were played with by a specific child who had a name and preferences and fears and a particular way of laughing. That letter was being written by a person who expected to finish it, who had somewhere to be after they finished it, who had no idea that the sentence they were in the middle of was the last ordinary thing they would ever do. The grand conspiracies we have been tracing, the Vault experiments and the Enclave's plans, and the FEV programs and all the rest, are all built from the same raw material. The lives of people who did not know any of this was happening to them. People who woke up on the 23rd of October 2077 and had a normal morning, or as normal a morning as was possible in a world already stressed by resource wars and political tension, and then heard the sirens, and then saw the sky change. The conspiracy theories in the Fallout universe matter because they explain how that happened. They trace the decisions and the decision makers, the plans and the planners, the chain of choices that led from a boardroom meeting about who gets to own the future to the light that erased the horizon. Understanding that chain does not undo anything. It does not bring anyone back. But it makes the silence between radio signals legible in a different way. It means the silence is not random. It is the sound of a specific series of decisions playing out to their conclusion. And that means it is also, in the most uncomfortable possible sense, a sound that belongs to a world we are still capable of recognizing. Because the decisions that made it were not made by monsters in the fairy tale sense. They were made by people who believed they were being rational, who believed their interests were important enough to justify the methods they used to protect them, who believed that the people in the way were a manageable cost. That is the real conspiracy at the center of the Fallout universe. Not the specific details of Vault-Tech's experiments, or the Enclave's oil rig, or the Institute's synth program, though all of those are real and worth understanding. The real conspiracy is the one that allows ordinary institutional logic to produce extraordinary institutional evil, when the feedback mechanisms that would normally correct it have been captured or removed. The silence between radio signals is what happens when that conspiracy succeeds. And the signal coming back, the voice through the static, the old song crackling back into audibility as you crest a hill and catch the broadcast again, is what happens when people decide, despite everything, to keep talking to each other anyway. That choice, made again and again across 200 years of ruins, is the only counterweight the wasteland has ever found to everything it has been through. Not a plan, not an ideology, not a faction with the right theory of civilization. Just the choice to keep the signal going, to keep talking, to keep assuming there is someone out there worth talking to. The Fallout universe bets, in the end, that this is enough. That it has always been enough. That the human capacity for connection, expressed in something as small as a radio signal carrying a 70-year-old song through a landscape of ash, is the thing that the grandest plans have consistently failed to account for, and the thing that has consistently outlasted them. That is the last theory, the simplest one, and the one the games have been building toward, quietly, in the space between everything else, the whole time.